What if I told you that some of the most disturbing stories of World War II never made it into the history books? Amidst the echoes of bombs and speeches recorded in black and white, truths that defy all logic are hidden. Sealed archives, witnesses who disappeared, technology that seemed decades ahead of its time. How could a Nazi submarine appear on South American shores without leaving a trace of its journey? What really happened to the objects hidden by the Nazis in the Barbaros Alps? And what secrets does the sea still hide beneath the rusted remains of warships? This is not the story you were told in class. It is the hidden part, the part that smells of gunpowder, betrayal, and silence. Get ready to discover the missing pieces of a conflict that marked the 20th century. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing is not the battles that were fought, but the questions that were never answered. So make yourself comfortable and join us on this journey through the darkest and most forgotten mysteries of World War II. Deep in the forests of Northern Europe, where winter silences the trees and fog creeps through the ruins of ancient fortresses, there is a whisper that has never faded. It speaks of a room built not of marble or stone, but of a more fragile and luminous material. Amber, not an ornament, not a decoration, but an architectural masterpiece that seemed to defy the very idea of the ephemeral. They called it the Amber Room, a name that to this day continues to evoke admiration and bewilderment. Imagine an entire room, walls, columns, panels, reliefs, covered in carved amber, gold, and mirrors. Under the dim candlelight, the place looked more like a pagan temple dedicated to the sun than a palace hall. Its orange glow was as hypnotic as it was intangible, as if it were a solid dream. It was a gift. In 1716, the Prussian King Frederick William I presented this marvel to Tsar Peter the Great of Russia as a symbol of alliance between empires. After a long journey and several reconstructions, it was installed in Catherine's palace in Tsarskoye-Selo, near St. Petersburg. There, amid the echoes of the Tsars and the murmur of the imperial halls, it remained for more than 2 centuries. But in 1941, when Nazi troops invaded the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa, something changed forever. German soldiers arriving at Catherine's palace found the Amber Room. Although the Soviets had tried to protect it by dismantling and hiding it, there was not enough time. In a matter of days, the Nazis completely dismantled it and sent it to Königsberg in what is now Kaliningrad. There, according to official documents, it was installed in the city's castle, and then, as if swallowed up by the fog of war itself, it disappeared. Since 1945, its whereabouts have remained one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of World War II. What happened to AR's camera? Was it destroyed in the Allied bombings of Königsberg? Was it secretly loaded onto a train that never reached its destination? Or does it lie at the bottom of the Baltic Sea inside a sunken ship, intact and forgotten? Theories abound. Some witnesses claim to have seen Nazi trucks transporting heavy wooden boxes during the final days of the war. Others speak of a train hidden in a sealed tunnel under the Polish mountains, loaded with gold, stolen art, and perhaps fragments of amber. More than one expedition has attempted to find it. Professional divers have explored shipwrecks in the depths of the sea, searching for traces of the lost amber. Teams of archaeologists have scoured archives and testimonies in search of clues. In 1997, some original panels appeared in Germany, but only fragments, as if someone had at some point tried to reconstruct or hide it. And this is where the story begins to branch off. Some theories suggest that high-ranking Nazis, obsessed with art and symbols of power, hid the camera in secret bunkers, along with other stolen pieces. There are even those who suggest that it may have been taken to South America, along with other fugitives from the regime. These ideas sound more like fiction, but in the absence of definitive proof, they cannot be completely ruled out. What if the Amber Room was never destroyed? What if it is still waiting in some dark place, sealed behind a wall underground, or in a damp cellar, waiting for someone to find it? The Russian government has attempted to reconstruct it, and today there is a meticulously crafted replica that can be visited in Catherine's palace, but it is not the same. It does not have the weight of history or the mystery that surrounds it. The original remains an open wound, an unanswered question, a symbol of beauty, power, and loss. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is not that it has been lost, but that after almost a century, we still do not know how or why. Perhaps it was destroyed, perhaps it is in the possession of someone who has never wanted to reveal its secret. Or perhaps, like all myths worthy of respect, the Amber Room has transcended the limits of the tangible to become something else, an idea, an echo, a promise hidden in the shadows. What do you think the Amber Camera is? And what would you do if one day you found it in front of you, intact, shining as bright as the day it was made, surrounded by silence? As we delve deeper into the lesser-known mysteries of World War II, we reach a point where history and legend begin to intertwine. From the quiet forests of Lower Silesia in southwestern Poland, a story emerges that, despite the passage of time, continues to fuel rumors, clandestine excavations, and a persistent feeling that something remains hidden underground. It is the so-called Nazi gold train. The legend begins in the final days of the war. It was 1945, and the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet troops were advancing relentlessly westward, and chaos was taking over the German command lines. Amidst this desperate retreat, it is said that an armored train, loaded with tons of gold, stolen art, and priceless objects, left Breslau, now Wrocław, bound for an unknown destination. Its goal was to hide somewhere safe before it fell into enemy hands, but that train never reappeared. The most widely repeated versions claim that the convoy vanished near the town of WWII, a mountainous area crisscrossed by tunnels, abandoned mines, and old railway lines used by the Nazis to transport strategic resources. And here the real mystery begins. For decades, not a single piece of conclusive evidence has confirmed its existence, but neither has it been completely disproved. In 2015, a discovery reignited the legend with a vengeance. Two researchers, one Polish and one German, claimed to have located the train using ground-penetrating radar technology. They claimed that the convoy lay hidden in a sealed tunnel near the tracks that crossed the Zayos forest, not far from the famous castle of the same name used by the Nazis during the conflict. The announcement sparked a veritable gold rush, with search teams, security measures, geological studies, and even the involvement of the Polish government. But when excavations began, the result was puzzling. No train was found, no tunnel, nothing but layers of earth, stone, and disappointment. Does that mean the train never existed? Not necessarily. Some historians argue that the Nazis could have sealed multiple tunnels in the area using explosives or natural camouflage. In fact, the region was part of the Reese Project, a vast underground network built by the Third Reich for purposes that remain unclear. The train could have been diverted to one of these hidden complexes. The speculation does not stop there. There is talk of secret vaults, of carriages containing not only gold, but also secret documents, religious relics, even experimental weapons. Others claim that the train was found by the Soviets and that its contents were hushed up and secretly moved during the Cold War. This hypothesis, although impossible to verify, is echoed in other documented disappearances of looted goods. And then there's the most disturbing theory that the train is still there beneath our feet, silent, protected by traps, structural collapses, or simply oblivion, that was never an invention, but a buried truth. But why this obsession with a train? Perhaps because it represents something more than a simple shipment of gold. It represents the attempt of a dying regime to preserve its wealth, its legacy, or its darkest secrets. It represents the echo of a past that refuses to be fully revealed. Today, the forests of WWII remain quiet. The birds sing, the branches rustle, and a heavy silence hangs between the hills. But beneath the surface, a train loaded with history could still be hidden, waiting to be discovered, or it could all be part of a collective illusion. Fueled by hope, greed, and fascination with the secrets of the Third Reich. Whatever the truth may be, the Nazi gold train remains one of the most persistent, enigmatic, and emotionally charged stories of World War II. An endless trail, an unanswered quest. And until something definitive is found, the question will continue to hang in the air, as thick as the fog in the Polish forests. What is really buried beneath WWII? And who will dare to dig it up? From the cold silence of an underground bunker, beneath the smoking ruins of a dying Berlin, the official story claims that it all ended there, that on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, cornered by imminent defeat, took his own life alongside Eva Braun, sealing with fire and darkness the end of an era marked by horror. The Soviets supposedly found his charred remains shortly afterwards, but they never showed conclusive evidence. The Führer's bunker, now buried underground and covered by modern buildings, was for years the epicenter of the most uncomfortable debate of the post-war period. Did Hitler really die there? Or did he manage, in the final moments of the Third Reich, to make an impossible escape and disappear into the shadows of a world still reeling from the conflict? For decades, the official documents were clear. Hitler was dead. However, something did not quite add up. Soviet forensic reports were inconsistent, even contradictory. The alleged dental evidence, the only physical evidence, was based on secondary accounts and incomplete remains. Shortly after the war, Stalin even claimed that Hitler could have escaped. Was this mere propaganda, or did he know something that others did not? From there, the mystery took on a life of its own, with intelligence reports, witnesses, and declassified documents. From Argentina to Spain, Brazil, Paraguay, and even Egypt, stories began to emerge of a man who looked like Hitler. Neighbors swore they had seen the man himself living on a farm at the foot of the Andes. Former Nazi officers who, when questioned, whispered of a secret evacuation operation by submarine, Mossad and CIA agents who, years later, would follow trails as vague as they were persistent. One of the elements that most fueled this theory was the well-known Ratlin, a Nazi escape network that allowed hundreds of war criminals to flee Europe after the surrender. With the help of sympathizers, false documents, and even logistical support from some sectors of the church, figures such as Joseph Mengele and Adolf Eichmann managed to disappear for years. If they could, why not Hitler? In 2017, declassified FBI documents showed that the agency had investigated reports suggesting that Hitler had fled to South America for years. None of these reports were considered conclusive, but their existence fueled further doubt. If the dictator's death was a closed case, why continue investigating? In Argentina, in particular, the legend took deep root. Patagonia, vast, remote, and poorly monitored after the war, was the ideal setting to imagine a new life in hiding. Some independent researchers claim that Hitler lived in Bariloche under a false identity, accompanied by former SS officers. There is even talk of photographs, plans of hideouts, and reports from foreign intelligence services, but all of this remains circumstantial, disjointed, and shrouded in a thick veil of uncertainty. And then there is science. In 2009, a forensic study carried out by U.S. researchers on a skull fragment allegedly belonging to Hitler and preserved by the Russians revealed something puzzling. The skull was actually that of a woman under the age of 40, a simple cataloging error or another piece in a disturbing puzzle. To this day, Hitler's supposedly authentic remains have not been subjected to definitive DNA testing with complete transparency. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this mystery is not the possibility that he escaped. It is what the idea represents, that someone responsible for millions of deaths, for the most devastating conflict of the 20th century, could have evaded justice and lived out the rest of his days in silence, protected by hidden loyalties and the chaos of the post-war period. It is a possibility that challenges historical memory and that many, even today, prefer not to consider. But in the absence of solid evidence, the void is filled with questions. What if the body found in Berlin was never really his? What hands would have been needed to carry out such an escape in the midst of the collapse of the Reich? And why, after more than 75 years, is there still no universally accepted version of his final fate? The mystery of Hitler's possible escape continues to beat silently on the margins of official history. Perhaps it will never be completely resolved. Perhaps we can only continue to trace the blurred footprints he left in the fog of those last days. But if there ever was a man capable of disappearing into the cracks of the world, leaving behind a collapsed empire and a legacy of horror, that man was Adolf Hitler. And so, beneath concrete slabs in Berlin or among the mountains of South America, a question remains unanswered, a suspicion buried under decades of silence. Did Hitler really die on that day, in April 1945, or was it just the beginning of another chapter never written from the heights of the mountains of Lower Silesia, where forests stretch like a dark blanket and the wind whistles through the ruins of forgotten structures? A peculiar construction stands tall. It has no roof or windows, only concrete columns forming a ring like the remains of an old industrial facility. The locals call it the Hench, but those who know the rumors associate it with something much more disturbing. Die Glocke. The bell was not a common bell or a weapon in the traditional sense. According to certain documents and post-war reports, it was a top-secret project of the Third Reich, developed in the final years of the conflict, when German defeat seemed inevitable and the strangest, most desperate and ambitious research was taking shape in hidden laboratories. Die Glocke was said to be a device shaped like a metal bell approximately 3 m high, covered with a kind of ceramic or heavy metal. Inside, it contained 2 cylinders that rotated in opposite directions and, according to reports, required a strange substance known as Serum 525, which was violet in color and highly radioactive. When activated, the device supposedly generated extraordinary physical effects. But what was it really? An experiment with anti-gravity energy, a time machine, a prototype of advanced propulsion, or simply a myth born of the smoke of a war that even at its end still burned with delusions of absolute power? The most widely cited testimony comes from a Polish informant named Igor Witkowski, who claimed to have accessed Soviet interrogation documents after the war. In them, a Nazi officer recounted the workings of Die Glocke, describing strange side effects, plants that decomposed rapidly, animals that died instantly, and even alterations in the flow of time for those who were near the device while it was operating. The alleged test site was near the Wences Lau mine in an underground facility surrounded by extreme security measures. Some believe that this location was part of Project Reese, a network of tunnels and underground complexes dug by the Nazis in southern Poland for military purposes that have not yet been fully clarified. But as with so many mysteries of World War II, confirmed details are scarce, while speculation grows with each passing year. Over time, the story of Glocke has been linked to other unsolved enigmas, including UFO sightings in the years following the war, advanced Nazi technology that seemed ahead of its time, and even the Paperclip Project, in which German scientists were secretly brought to the United States at the end of the conflict. Advanced Nazi technology that seemed ahead of its time, and even with Project Paperclip, whereby German scientists were secretly brought to the United States at the end of the war, could some of the knowledge developed around Die Glocke have been transferred to America and continued in laboratories such as Los Alamos or W. Patterson? Some more daring researchers have suggested an even more disturbing connection, that Die Glocke was not of purely human origin, that the Nazis, in their obsession with the occult and ancient technologies, may have gained access to lost or even extraterrestrial knowledge that they attempted to reproduce without fully understanding it. But even without crossing that line, there are enough elements to keep the intrigue alive. Why are there no concrete official documents that mention Glocke's existence if so many rumors point to it? Why did some scientists who worked on projects related to advanced propulsion mysteriously disappear at the end of the war? And what is the connection between this object and the unusual concrete structures that still stand in the Ludwikowice-Kłodzkie area? The most skeptical historians argue that all this is nothing more than later exaggeration, a myth born of the desire to find the inexplicable at the heart of one of the darkest regimes in history. That if Die Glocke ever existed, It was nothing more than an experiment with no concrete results, a failed attempt. But the mystery persists, the feeling that a key piece of the puzzle is still missing. That in some forgotten archive, in some sealed tunnel, or perhaps in the censored pages of a military logbook, the truth may be hidden. And so, amid the echoes of engines that no longer roar and doors that have never been opened again, Die Glocke remains one of the most enigmatic symbols of the end of the Third Reich. An artifact that perhaps never existed or should never have existed. Was Die Glocke a real machine, or just a reflection of humanity's fear of power without limits? And if it was ever turned on, what did it actually turn on? In the peaceful fields of northern France, where wheat and lavender now grow under leaden skies, there was once an army that did not exist. On muddy roads, in silent forests and deserted villages, engines roared, tents were pitched, tanks were seen, and yet it was all an illusion so perfectly executed that it fooled the enemy itself. It was one of the strangest, most ingenious, and least known operations of the Second World War, the so-called Peyton's Ghost Army, officially known as the 23rd Special Troops Company. This unique group was deployed by the U.S. Army with a radical purpose: to create a fictitious war. It was not about shooting, but about pretending, about feigning movements, deployments, imminent attacks, an army made of rubber, sound, and smoke, a war theater carefully designed to manipulate the enemy's perception. The story began in 1944, shortly after D-Day. While Allied troops fought to advance in Normandy, the High Command needed to protect its real operations with effective distractions. Thus was born a unit composed of artists, set designers, sound experts, fashion designers, and soldiers trained in the art of deception. They carried no heavy weapons, just canvases, loudspeakers, and inflatable tanks. The soldiers in this unit inflated life-size armored vehicles and placed them strategically so that they were visible from the air. They used recordings of military noise, roaring engines, and metal chains, which they played back through giant loudspeakers in empty fields. They operated fake radios with coded transmissions that mimicked the communications of a real division. They even walked in circles in areas visible to German spies, simulating massive troop movements. But the most shocking part was the use of General George S. Patton as part of the deception. After being temporarily removed from command following an incident involving wounded soldiers, Patton was chosen as a high-profile decoy. He was symbolically assigned to command this fictitious army, supposedly stationed in Dover and preparing to invade Calais, while the real landing took place in Normandy. The operation was a success. Hitler, convinced that the real attack had not yet begun, kept his armored divisions away from Normandy for crucial weeks. The deception worked, but its full extent was not known until many years later. Why? Why was such an extraordinary episode kept secret for so long? And why does it barely feature in traditional accounts of the war? Part of the answer lies in the very nature of the deception. Its effectiveness depended on silence, on remaining in the shadows. Many of the soldiers who took part in Operation Venetia never spoke about it until the archives were declassified in the 1990s. Even today, it is estimated that there are operations within the operation that have not yet been fully revealed. And this is where the story begins to get more disturbing. There are testimonies that speak of even more sophisticated tactics, difficult to believe, of light projectors that simulated night vision, of explosives that generated tank tracks in the mud, even of Peyton doubles who appeared at different points in Europe to confuse German espionage. Other more daring researchers have suggested that the Ghost Army was only the visible part of a broader program of psychological manipulation developed with the help of experts in propaganda, hypnosis, and even experimental techniques of collective management. To what extent can the perception of a war be shaped? Can a shadow cause more fear than a bullet? And then there is the deeper question. If this level of deception was possible in 1944, what other operations of camouflage, disinformation, or illusion have been carried out without the world's knowledge? The truth is that Peyton's Phantom Army was a masterpiece of unconventional strategy, a war fought without shots being fired, where imagination, art, and theater became weapons as effective as real tanks. But it also leaves a trail of doubts, a void of information, a lingering feeling that there is much more to the story than has been told. Today, in some fields in France, you can still find the remains of tarpaulins, poles, and traces of this forgotten unit. When asked, the locals sometimes recall the sounds of trucks on empty roads, lights in the night without camps, voices fading away with the wind. And one wonders with some unease, how many times in the midst of war did we see what they wanted us to see and never what really happened? Can a carefully constructed lie change the course of history? And how many ghosts like those of this army still walk silently on the margins of the official truth? Following the echoes of Peyton's Ghost Army, where deception became strategy, we leave the European fields and travel to one of the most remote, inhospitable, and enigmatic places on the planet, Antarctica. A continent covered by miles of ice, seemingly uninhabited, motionless, silent. And yet, in 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States mobilized one of the largest military expeditions ever seen in peacetime to this frozen desert. They called Operation High Jump. What began as a scientific mission led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd quickly became an inexhaustible source of theories, speculation, and unanswered questions. Officially, it was a polar training and reconnaissance exercise aimed at testing military equipment in extreme conditions, establishing Antarctic bases, and strengthening the U.S. presence in the region. But the numbers didn't quite add up for a simple scientific expedition. More than 4,000 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft, a disproportionate deployment for a meteorological or geographical study. What really motivated such an operation in such an isolated place? And why, despite being planned to last between 6 and 8 months, was it abruptly interrupted after only 8 weeks? This is where the mystery begins. Various reports from the time indicate that during the operation there were clashes, unexplained plane crashes, and significant human losses. Some witnesses claim that several planes were shot down for no apparent reason, that unidentified flying objects were reported, and that Admiral Byrd himself, upon his return, warned in an interview that the next conflict could come from the South Pole with incredible speed and technology that the world does not yet understand. This statement, attributed to Byrd by Chilean media at the time, has fueled the most intriguing theories for decades. One of the most persistent links high jump to the alleged escape of Nazi officers to secret bases in Antarctica after the fall of the Third Reich. According to this hypothesis, the Nazis established an underground base known as Base 211 or Nieuwegein in the Queen Maud Land region, where they transferred advanced technology, scientific research, and key members of the regime. Could Operation High Jump have been an attempt to locate or even confront this Nazi presence on the White Continent? There is no definitive evidence to support this theory, but there are some striking facts. Germany carried out expeditions to Antarctica before and during the war, claiming territories, mapping remote areas, and even dropping flags with swastikas from the air. In addition, after the war, multiple German submarines disappeared without a trace. Some were found years later off the coast of South America. Others never appeared. The lack of clear explanations for the premature failure of High Jump has been fertile ground for alternative interpretations. Was there really a confrontation with an unknown force? Was it a covert operation disguised as a scientific mission? Or was it simply a failed military venture whose mistakes have been covered up over the years? Over the decades, new documents have come to light, but many remain classified. Some independent researchers suggest that the United States discovered something in Antarctica that it did not expect to find, and that what happened there was not a simple logistical withdrawal, but a strategic retreat. The most daring theories speak of non-human technologies hidden under the ice, impossible structures detected by radar, or covert contacts that forced the operation to cease. Others lean toward more rational explanations, such as planning errors, extreme weather conditions, and a lack of resources, but something still doesn't add up. The Antarctic continent, covered by glaciers thousands of meters thick, is one of the last great unexplored spaces on the planet. Its isolation has been both a barrier and shield. And amid that white silence, Operation High Jump remains a crack in the official narrative. What really motivated the United States to organize the largest military expedition to the South Pole just after the war? What did they see there that justified their abrupt return? And why, after almost 80 years, has the whole story still not been told? Today, the bases in Antarctica operate in the name of science under international cooperation treaties. But the echo of High Jump remains. Cold, incomplete, like the distant crack of a glacier breaking in the distance. And what if beneath the ice, in tunnels that no one has yet explored, lies not only the past, but also a secret that is still waiting to be discovered? As we leave behind the eternal ice of Antarctica and the shadows that surround Operation High Jump, our journey now takes us to a place with a completely different climate, but with a mystery just as deep. The humid, mountainous, and dense jungles of the Philippines, beneath their tangled roots, among forgotten tunnels, sealed caves and slopes eroded by time. Hidden, according to many, is one of the greatest missing spoils of modern history, Yamashita's treasure. The name comes from Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, nicknamed the Tiger of Malaya, famous for his rapid conquests in Southeast Asia during World War II. But it is his alleged last mission in the final months of the war that has given rise to a legend that still echoes today in the corridors of the secret history of the war. During the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, it is estimated that thousands of tons of gold, jewels, works of art, and religious relics were looted from banks, temples, and palaces in countries such as Malaysia, Burma, Thailand, and Indonesia. The destination of this immense treasure, at least according to some reports, was not Japan directly, but the Philippines, a strategic point from which to later transfer it to the Japanese archipelago. But the war ended before that could happen. With Allied forces advancing and Japanese surrender increasingly imminent, Yamashita and his officers, in collaboration with engineers and forced laborers, allegedly hid the loot in a network of tunnels and fortified caves in the Philippines, especially on the island of Luzon. Some entrances were sealed with explosives, others were deliberately flooded, and many, according to rumors, were protected with deadly traps or simply forgotten. Is this story true? Did Yamashita's treasure really exist? Historical records are ambiguous. Yamashita was captured by U.S. forces in 1945 and later executed for war crimes. He never spoke, at least publicly, about the treasure. But silence did not extinguish the flame of mystery. In the years that followed, disturbing clues began to emerge. Coded maps, testimonies from Japanese soldiers, accounts from locals who had witnessed nighttime movements, strange convoys, underground constructions, and later, even sworn confessions and documentary fragments that pointed to a possible cover-up not only by Japan, but also by high-ranking U.S. officials. One of the key figures in this story is Rogelio Roxas, a Filipino treasure hunter who in the 1970s claimed to have found part of the treasure in Baguio, including a solid Buddha statue that turned out to be made of gold. Shortly after making his discovery public, he was arrested, tortured, and his find disappeared. Roxas took the case to international courts, and in 1996, a judge in Hawaii concluded that the then-dictator Ferdinand Marcos had confiscated part of the treasure and benefited personally from it. But how much was actually recovered? Was that all? Or just a fragment of a much larger treasure? The figures being bandied about are astronomical. There's talk of between 6,000 and 10,000 tons of gold hidden in more than 100 locations. If that were true, Yamashita's treasure would not only be the greatest hidden fortune in history, but also a geopolitical mystery with profound implications. And this is where the theories begin. Some researchers argue that when the U.S. intelligence services found the gold, they decided not to return it, but to use it to finance clandestine operations during the Cold War. A kind of secret slush fund managed outside the official budgets. Others go further and claim that the treasure is still underground, partly or entirely forgotten or carefully guarded, waiting to be discovered or kept in the shadows. But even leaving aside the most daring theories, the mere possibility that such wealth remains hidden beneath the Philippine soil generates a magnetism that is difficult to ignore. To this day, there are still those who, armed with old maps, scanning technology, and a mixture of faith and ambition, venture into the jungles of Luzon in search of gold. Many return empty-handed, some disappear, others remain silent. Why so much secrecy? What is being protected? And what would be the consequences of finally revealing the existence of Yamashita's treasure? In a world marked by wars, looting, and official silence, hidden gold represents not only material wealth, but also memory, justice, and power. And it is perhaps this combination that keeps this mystery alive. Beyond time, beyond dust and mud, is the treasure still there, waiting beneath the roots and rocks of the Philippines? Or has its story been buried, like so many other truths, under layers of misinformation and oblivion? Perhaps in some collapsed tunnel or in a still-sealed chamber, the metallic echo of Yamashita's gold continues to resonate, waiting to be heard. From the jungles of the Philippines and the echoes of gold buried in sealed chambers, the path of mystery leads us back to Europe, to medieval castles shrouded in mist, to silent corridors where the walls still bear symbols, engraved with ritual precision, to nighttime rituals, ancient relics, and an obsession that for years was considered legend until the archives began to speak. We now delve into one of the darkest and least understood aspects of the Third Reich, the occult division of the Nazis, a secret network of esoteric symbols, arcane beliefs, and mystical aspirations that, according to many, form part of the ideological core of the regime's elites. The place most associated with this story is Wilsberg Castle in western Germany. From the outside, it looks like a typical German Renaissance fortress with its sober stonework and triangular structure. But inside, especially in the underground chambers and the so-called Black Room, symbols have been found that have little to do with military architecture. Germanic runes, stone circles, references to the Grail, Valhalla, and even the underground world of Norse mythology. It was in this castle that Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the most powerful men in the Nazi regime, established a kind of spiritual headquarters. According to documents and research, Himmler envisioned Wilsberg as the center of a new Germanic religion, where carefully selected SS high commanders would gather in secret ceremonies to connect with the ancestral Aryan race and channel a power beyond the material world. Was this mere megalomania, or was there something more? The occult division of the SS, known as the ANEB, was officially presented as a scientific organization, dedicated to the study of ancient Germanic history. However, its expeditions and activities reveal a much more enigmatic agenda. Between 1935 and 1945, the ANEB funded research in Iceland, Egypt, Tibet, South America, and other strategic locations, searching for everything from Atlantis to the remains of lost civilizations that, according to their interpretation, validated the supremacy of the Aryan race. They were interested in alchemical texts, Hermetic knowledge, ancient technologies, and objects considered magical or sacred. One of their most controversial objectives was the search for the Holy Grail. Himmler was convinced that this relic, beyond its religious value, contained a symbolic power capable of legitimizing the spiritual dominance of the SS. In this context, the myth of the Grail was reinterpreted not as a Christian cup, but as a pagan artifact, possibly linked to forbidden knowledge or even energies of unknown origin. Another recurring symbol was the swastika, originally taken from Indo-European and Asian cultures as a representation of the sun, eternity, and rebirth. The Nazis reinterpreted it, giving an almost mystical character that transcended the political and became part of a deeply esoteric worldview, where history had to be rewritten as a struggle between sacred and decadent lineages. But what is most disturbing is what is still unknown. Many of the ANEB archives were destroyed in the final days of the war. Others remain classified or incomplete. What survives suggests that there were rituals, translations of forbidden texts, experiments with energy resonance, and a systematic search for knowledge considered supernatural. There has even been talk of the alleged use of mediums, astrology applied to military campaigns, and contact with what they called non-human ancestral wisdom. Was all this part of a carefully constructed propaganda apparatus? Or did certain figures in the regime really believe in these practices? Many historians argue that, far from being a personal extravagance of Himmler's, occultism was a tool of power used to give the Reich a mythical foundation. But there are those who argue that some members of the inner circle were convinced that lost ancient knowledge could be recovered and used. The most extreme theories connect the Agna nerve to unrecognized archaeological discoveries, underground bases, hidden advanced technology, and contact with entities or forces beyond our comprehension. Ideas that, although difficult to prove, continue to generate fascination, and regardless of what one believes or not, one irrefutable fact remains. The Nazi regime invested time, resources, and human lives in searching for something that transcended the political or military, something they believed could be found in myths, ancient stones, and forgotten codices, something they may never have found or never revealed. Today, Wilsburg Castle still stands and can be visited. Its walls no longer whisper rituals, but its history has not been erased. The Black Room, with its 12-ray emblem on the floor, continues to raise unanswered questions. Questions that force us to look at the most irrational and symbolic side of a regime that, despite its brutal military modernity, clung to an archaic, spiritual, and deeply dangerous vision. What was the occult division of the SS really looking for? Was it just a fantasy shared by fanatics? Or are there still truths hidden beneath the layers of symbolism waiting to be deciphered? In a forgotten corner of history, among silent ruins and burned documents, perhaps the answers are still there, waiting for someone to dare to look. After exploring the shadows of the occult beliefs of the Third Reich, where myths and symbols shaped real decisions, we now literally dive into one of the most disturbing maritime mysteries of World War II. In the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic, where the winds blow like knives and the ocean seems bottomless, a silent steel giant vanished into thin air. A feared weapon, a symbol of Nazi naval power, the submarine U-47. It was October 1939 when the U-47, commanded by the famous Commander Gunnar Prien, sneaked into the Bay of Escapaflow, the most protected naval base in the United Kingdom, and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak. It was a daring, almost suicidal feat that made Prien an instant hero for Nazi propaganda. The U-47 returned to Germany to cheers, and its captain was decorated personally by Hitler. But just 17 months later, this same submarine would disappear without a trace. No distress signals, no debris floating in the sea, nothing. On March 7, 1941, the U-47 left its base in Lorient, France, for what would be its 10th patrol. Its mission was to intercept British convoys in the North Atlantic, near the British Isles. It was a dangerous war zone, where German submarines lurked like wolves beneath the waves, but also where Allied forces were becoming increasingly better organized. Contact with U-47 was lost around March 7th. It never transmitted another signal. The British Admiralty claimed at the time that the submarine had been sunk by depth charges launched by the destroyer HMS Wolverine. But the official records of that operation were inconclusive. No wreckage was found. There was no visual confirmation, only a possible vague and distant sound of implosion. What really happened? The disappearance of U-47 gave rise to a cascade of theories. Some point to a technical failure, an internal explosion, a defective torpedo, or a toxic gas leak that incapacitated the crew. Possible, yes, but so quick and so complete that it left no trace. Others suggest a fatal error during an emergency dive, trapped in a current or collapsed by the pressure of the ocean. But the most disturbing thing is that, unlike other submarines lost during the war, the wreck of the U-47 has never been located. not even with modern tracking technology, nor in the multiple sweeps carried out in recent decades on the seabed where it supposedly disappeared. A tangible physical void, as if the U-47 had vanished into thin air. And here the more speculative theories emerge. Some alternative researchers have raised the possibility that the submarine was secretly captured by Allied forces for study. This information could have been concealed for strategic reasons. In the midst of war with tensions and propaganda at their height, the capture of a high-profile German vessel, such as the U-47, would have been an intelligence treasure, but also a secret worth keeping. Other theories point to a darker possibility. The U-47 was the victim of friendly fire, sunk by mistake by another German submarine or ship. An accident shrouded in silence to protect morale. But there are those who go even further, linking its disappearance to a handful of strange reports received by radio amateurs and listening stations shortly after March 7th. Coded messages, interrupted signals, distorted fragments of conversation, echoes of what could have been a distress call, or simply background noise. Could the U-47 have gone further than we think? To another area of the Atlantic, or even to the American coast? Was it destroyed by unknown forces, natural or human? Or is it still intact somewhere deep in the ocean, sealed by the silence of time? Commander Preen, an almost mythological figure in the Kriegsmarine, disappeared with his crew, without ceremony, without answers. The fate of the submarine that had achieved the most daring feat of German submarine warfare was ironically shrouded in the same fog it had once navigated to attack the heart of the British Navy. Today, the U-47 is remembered in naval monuments and history books, but its last patrol remains a blank page, an unfinished chapter, a metallic echo that still seems to resonate beneath the Atlantic between cold currents and invisible crests. Whereas the U-47, was it just another casualty of the chaos of war? Or does its disappearance hold secrets that no one dares to unearth? In a sea where hundreds of submarines have been found, only one remains missing. And that perhaps says more than we imagine. After the abysmal silence surrounding the disappearance of the U-47 submarine, we emerge from the Atlantic to look up at another equally disturbing scene. Equally disturbing, the sky. Because during the final years of World War II, when humanity was fighting for control of the land and sea, something inexplicable began to appear above the clouds. Small spheres of light, bright objects that flew close to airplanes, defying the laws of physics. They were called Foo Fighters. The term was coined by American pilots stationed in Europe, especially in the 405th Night Fighter Squadron. Flying in the darkness at high altitude, they began to notice the presence of orange, white, or reddish lights that appeared without warning and moved at impossible speeds. These were not flares or reflections, but lights that followed them, sometimes surrounding their planes and then disappearing without a trace. Early reports described spherical objects of varying sizes that often approached bombers and fighters on missions. The most disconcerting thing was that they showed no intention of attacking, did not fire, did not interfere with the systems, but simply observed and disappeared. A new enemy technology, an optical illusion caused by combat stress, atmospheric phenomena not yet understood. Conventional explanations were quick to emerge. Some suggested that it was San Telmo fire, an electrical phenomenon that sometimes forms around objects in extreme weather conditions. Others spoke of reflections on the plexiglass of the cockpits, or even hallucinations induced by fatigue, but the reports were too numerous, too consistent, too detailed, and came not only from Allied pilots, but also from Germans and Japanese. Both sides at different times thought that the enemy had developed some kind of advanced drone or light distraction weapon, but there was no evidence. No one recovered one. No radar picked them up, and yet the stories continued. On a December night in 1944, 2 pilots from the U.S. squadron reported being followed by several of these spheres of light for more than 30 kilometers. They attempted evasive maneuvers, climbing, descending, and changing course, but the lights remained. They were not flares. They were not meteors. They moved intelligently, with intent. After the war, the phenomenon was filed away, classified, and in many cases forgotten. But the term Foo Fighters had already taken root. Years later, when reports of unidentified flying objects began to surface in peacetime, many researchers turned their attention back to those wartime skies. The Foo Fighters were the first modern UFOs. Some proponents of this theory argue that the skies of World War II were the first mass observation field for this type of phenomenon, that what the pilots saw and documented was not an illusion, but indirect contact with something we do not understand. Observers, non-human technology, or simply witnesses to a type of natural phenomenon not yet cataloged by science. But there are also those who point to more earthly theories, though no less disturbing. Certain researchers have suggested that the Foo Fighters could have been secret prototypes of the Third Reich, experiments with advanced propulsion systems developed by hidden divisions of the SS or even by the NER. Electromagnetic observation vehicles, distraction weapons. Hitler may have ordered the deployment of these technologies in the final stages of the conflict as a form of intimidation or as an experimental test. What is puzzling is that neither the Allied nor German documents have ever revealed any verified technical information about these objects. What we do have are field reports, logbook entries, and testimonies in subsequent interviews, all with a common pattern. Luminous spheres, controlled movement, absolute silence, and then nothing. None were captured. There are no conclusive photographs. No wreckage was recovered. It is as if these lights existed only during the war and then disappeared with it. Today, the Foo Fighters phenomenon remains one of the most enigmatic chapters of the conflict and perhaps one of the most forgotten. It does not appear in school books, it is not taught in military academies, but it remains etched in the memory of those who saw it with their own eyes flying blind over Europe or the Pacific, wondering if those lights were allies, enemies, or something else entirely. Or the Foo Fighters. An atmospheric effect that is still unexplained, secret technology that never saw the light of day, or a phenomenon that has been with us since time immemorial, but only dared to show itself in wartime? Whatever the answer, the truth is that those lights streaked across the darkest skies in modern history and did so without leaving a trace. Only questions remain, questions that still silently illuminate the night of mystery. After the dark skies of World War II and the silent lights, known as the Foo Fighters, we now move across the Atlantic to a small town nestled in the forests of Pennsylvania. It was December 9th, 1965. It was already night. The air was still and freezing, and then something crossed the sky. A bright object enveloped in a trail of fire streaked across the sky in the northeastern United States, from Michigan to Ohio, before descending sharply toward the trees surrounding Kecksburg, a quiet town of just a few hundred inhabitants. It was seen by dozens of people. Calls were made to police stations. There was talk of a meteorite, a spaceship, an explosion. But what happened next turned the event into one of the most enigmatic cases in contemporary history. And according to some researchers, in a hidden chapter linked to the unsolved mysteries of World War II, several local witnesses, upon arriving at the site where the object had fallen, a clearing in the forest, described a bell, or capsule-shaped metal structure about 3 m long, covered with what appeared to be strange inscriptions, not in any known language, but rather like symbols engraved in relief. But within hours, everything changed. The area was quickly cordoned off by military personnel. Trucks, transport equipment, and even a crane arrived. Access was blocked. Witnesses were removed. Some claimed to have been warned not to talk about the incident, and the object disappeared. Officially, the U.S. government explained that it was nothing out of the ordinary, that there was no trace of a fallen object, that what had been seen was probably a meteor or Soviet space junk that disintegrated upon entering the atmosphere. But many things did not add up. The object's behavior did not correspond to an uncontrolled ballistic fall. There was no explosion on impact, and several Kecksburg residents claimed that what they saw did not disintegrate in the sky, but landed intact and under control among the trees. This is where the real mystery begins. What was that object? And why did the military remove it so quickly and secretly? One of the most widely repeated theories is that the device could have been a Soviet spy capsule, part of the Cosmos space program. However, this hypothesis has not been confirmed by documents. In addition, the alleged object had inscriptions that did not match the Cyrillic alphabet, and its shape was more reminiscent of an experimental design than a conventional probe. And then another much more disturbing possibility arises, one that connects directly to the darkest remnants of Nazism. Some researchers have linked the Kecksburg object to Dig Lock, the alleged secret device developed by scientists of the Third Reich in the final years of World War II. A metal bell that was said to have been part of experiments with anti-gravity technology, unknown energy, or even time travel. The description of Kecksburg, a bell-shaped capsule with embossed inscriptions and anomalous flight behavior, matches the speculative reports about Dig Lock in a disturbing way. It could have been the Kecksburg object, a technology rescued and transferred to the United States after the war as part of Project Paperclip, a test that went wrong and fell in an unplanned area, or even more disturbingly, it may not have been human at all. The extraterrestrial hypothesis has been widely discussed, although always shrouded in skepticism, but those who support it point to certain details. The precision of the descent, the soundless speed, the absence of heat or apparent structural damage, and above all the immediate military treatment, as if what had fallen there was already known in advance. In the years that followed, several attempts to declassify information about Kecksburg have been rejected or handed over with incomplete documents. Even media outlets, such as the History Channel and civil organizations, have filed lawsuits to obtain transparency. In 2005, NASA admitted that it had studied the case, but that the files had been lost, a response that, far from closing the mystery, amplified it. Today, Kecksburg has turned the incident into part of its identity. There are replicas of the object, local festivals, and tours of the woods where it all happened. But behind this almost folkloric facade, a question remains that no one has been able to answer with certainty. What fell in the forest that night in December 1965? A secret project inherited from the Third Reich, a carefully concealed Soviet artifact, or something that completely defies our understanding of technology. The answers remain sealed, the documents lost, and the clearing in the forest where it all began remains silent. Sometimes the mysteries of war do not end with the armistice. Sometimes they continue to fall from the sky. After the disturbing incident in the Pennsylvania woods with the object that fell in Kecksburg, we leave the mainland behind and enter one of the most baffling scenarios of the 20th century. The ocean. Not just any ocean, but a specific stretch of the Atlantic where compasses fail, transmissions are distorted, and sometimes the impossible happens. It is there between Florida, the Bahamas, and Puerto Rico that one of the most legendary mysteries of the post-war period was born. A true story, documented but still unsolved. The disappearance of Flight 19. On December 5, 1945, just a few months after the end of World War II, 5 TBM Avenger bomber planes of the United States Navy took off from the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale in Florida. They were part of a routine training mission. Over the sea, the weather was favorable, the crew experienced. Nothing indicated what was about to happen. What should have been a 3-hour navigation patrol turned into a nightmare minute by minute. At around 3:40 p.m., the mission commander, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, began sending confusing messages. He reported that his compasses were not working and that he could not recognize the coast below him. Despite air traffic control's efforts to guide them back, the messages became increasingly erratic. The pilots seemed convinced that they were over the Florida coast, when in fact, according to the estimated coordinates, they were flying in the opposite direction, lost at sea. The last transmission was chilling. Everything seemed strange, even the ocean. We're entering white water. It looks like we're there. And then there was complete silence. They were never heard from again. 5 planes missing, 14 men. Not a single piece of wreckage was found. No oil on the surface. No signs of impact, nothing. But the story doesn't end there. Hours after losing contact, a Martin Mariner seaplane with 13 crew members was sent on a search mission. It also disappeared. According to witnesses on the ground, there was an explosion in the sky, but no wreckage was found. In total, 27 men disappeared in less than a day, leaving no trace in one of the most heavily monitored areas of the Atlantic. The official version attributed the incident to disorientation on the part of Captain Taylor, navigation errors, and possibly fuel shortage. But radio records, along with the magnitude and peculiarity of the event, gave rise to a flood of questions. How is it possible that 5 planes flying in formation became disoriented simultaneously? Why did all the compasses fail? And how can the disappearance of the rescue plane sent shortly afterwards be explained? This is how Flight 19 became the centerpiece of a greater legend, the Bermuda Triangle, an area marked by unexplained disappearances of ships and aircraft since before the war. This case sparked talk of magnetic anomalies, dimensional portals, unknown atmospheric phenomena, and in some circles, even non-human intervention. There is no shortage of theories linking the disappearance to experimental Nazi technology. After World War II, some voices claimed that certain secret scientific developments may have been moved to remote locations or submarines, generating unknown effects. Could Flight 19 have been an accidental victim of one of these energy fields? Others suggest that it was a temporal distortion, a kind of bubble in which time and space fold. The phrase transmitted by one of the pilots, "We are entering white water," has been interpreted by some as an indication of fog or an optical phenomenon that altered their perception. But most puzzling of all is the total absence of wreckage. Even today, with modern ocean scanning technology, the TBM Avengers of Flight 19 remain missing. Despite multiple search operations, documentaries, and independent rescue missions, did they fall into a point in the ocean so deep and steep that they were buried forever? Or did they not fall, but were taken to another place? For years, family members, historians, and enthusiasts have kept the search alive not only for technical answers, but for emotional justice. To understand how, in the age of modern aviation, an entire squadron could disappear as if it had never existed. Today, at the Fort Lauderdale base, a commemorative plaque remembers those who disappeared on Flight 19, but beneath their names engraved in bronze, an absence that time has been unable to fill continues to beat. What really happened that afternoon in December 1945? Was a human error amplified by sea conditions? Physical interference that is still not understood? Or a door that opened for a moment and never closed again? In the vast silence of the Atlantic, where the surface hides secrets older than history itself, perhaps the echo of Flight 19's last message still lingers. A whisper that repeats itself like a call caught in the wind. Everything seems strange, even the ocean. From the deep Atlantic, where Flight 19 vanished into fog and silence, we change course. But the mystery continues, this time in the cold air of the English Channel. In the middle of winter 1944, there, amid low clouds and unpredictable currents, an unexpected figure vanished. Not a spy, not a soldier, but one of the brightest stars of his time. Glenn Miller, the world's most famous bandleader, disappeared without a trace while serving in the war. On December 15, 1944, Miller boarded a small UC-64 Norseman aircraft and airfield near London. His destination was Paris, where he was scheduled to prepare a performance for the Allied troops who had just arrived in the liberated city. The sky was overcast, the temperature low, the conditions difficult but not impossible. 3 people were on board: the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Norman Wiesel, and Glenn Miller. The flight took off and never arrived. There were no distress signals, no wreckage was found, no body appeared, nothing. Just a date marked in ink in the military archives and a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. Glenn Miller was not just a musician. He was a cultural phenomenon. His style defined the sound of a generation. Moonlight Serenade, In the Mood, Chattanooga Choo Choo. His melodies accompanied dance evenings in the United States, as well as moments of calm between bombings in Europe. His decision to join the war effort as a civilian in uniform was hailed as an act of patriotism. He conducted the United States Army Band in Europe. His mission was not to shoot, but to lift the spirits of an exhausted troop. So what happened? For years, the official version was simple. The plane was flying in dangerous weather conditions, without adequate instruments for navigation and low visibility, and probably crashed into the sea due to carburetor icing or pilot disorientation. But as so often happens, the details began to challenge that explanation. First, the UC-64 Norseman left no trace despite air and sea patrols monitoring the area. There were no signs of impact on the water or floating debris. Under normal conditions, something would have been found. Second, testimonies emerged that British planes were returning from a failed mission over Germany that same afternoon and dropped their bomb load over the English Channel, according to standard orders, to avoid dangerous landings. A widely held theory is that Miller's plane was flying below the group of bombers and was accidentally hit by the bombs. A tragic mistake covered up to protect morale in wartime. But that's just the start. Over the years, darker versions have emerged. Some claim that Miller never boarded the plane, that he was the victim of a covert operation, perhaps for espionage, blackmail, or confidential information that must not come to light. Others claim that he died in a Paris hospital under compromising circumstances and that his disappearance was fabricated to preserve his image. The most speculative theories go even further, claiming that Miller was involved in psychological operations with the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, using his fame to send coded messages or influence morale in enemy territory. Exaggerated, perhaps, but in a war where propaganda was as important as bullets, it is not a possibility that can be completely ruled out. The truth is that the U.S. government did not declassify certain documents related to the case until decades later, and even today there are still restricted reports. In 2017, a German historian claimed to have found evidence that Miller was briefly captured by German forces in a covert operation, but no conclusive evidence was ever provided. What if it was simply an accident? A small plane lost in bad weather like so many others during the war? Maybe, but something about Glenn Miller's story, his charisma, the moment, the void he left behind, makes his disappearance feel like more than just another disappearance. He was the symbol of an era, and his loss, just before the final victory, was perceived as a sad echo of human fragility in the midst of triumph. Today, over the English Channel, the wind continues to blow just as it did on that December afternoon. Clouds descend, covering the horizon, and at some invisible point in the sky or sea, Glenn Miller's flight of no return remains suspended in time. What really happened to the man who put music to war? Was it an accident erased by nature or a carefully buried secret? And why, after almost 80 years, have we still not found a single piece of his plane? Sometimes the most powerful sounds are not those that can be heard, but those that suddenly stop sounding. From the English Channel, where Glenn Miller's echo was lost forever in the clouds, we now enter the heart of Europe, among the alpine forests of Austria, where a dark and deep lake hides a mystery that has baffled historians, treasure hunters, and governments for decades. Lake Toplitz, surrounded by rocky walls and often covered by a persistent mist, looks like something out of Gothic tale. Its dark green, almost black waters reflect centuries-old fir trees and rugged peaks. It is a remote, isolated, silent place, but beneath its seemingly tranquil surface lies one of the best-kept secrets of the Third Reich, a sunken treasure, and perhaps much more. During the final months of World War II, with the Reich collapsing, many secret operations were activated in places like this. From 1943 onwards, the Toplitz area was used by the SS and the German Navy as a testing and covert operations center. Experiments with underwater explosives, commando training, and, according to multiple reports, the destruction or concealment of sensitive documents and materials were carried out there. But it was only after the war that the most disturbing rumors began to surface. In 1959, local divers found wooden boxes sunk deep beneath the surface, buried in the sediment at the bottom of the lake. Their contents shocked even the authorities. Millions of pounds of counterfeit banknotes, perfectly printed, with a level of detail that could only have been the product of a massive effort. It soon emerged that the find was linked to Operation Bernhard, a secret Third Reich plan designed to flood the British economy with counterfeit banknotes and destabilize it from within. That discovery was only the beginning. Over the years, further explorations uncovered new boxes, remnants of military equipment, deteriorated documentation, and unidentified metal parts. And although official investigations spoke only of propaganda material and counterfeit money, many believe that something much more valuable remains hidden in the depths of the lake. WWII. One of the most widely repeated suggests that the Nazis threw tons of stolen gold into the lake, including ingots from European banks, jewelry confiscated from Jewish families, and priceless works of art, all hidden to prevent it from falling into Allied hands. There are even those who claim that part of the treasure from the legendary Nazi gold train, believed to have disappeared in Poland, may have been diverted to Austria and sunk in toplets forever. But the depth and unique conditions of the lake make exploring its waters an extremely difficult task. At a depth of about 20 meters, oxygen is almost completely depleted. Further down, life disappears and the water becomes dense, stagnant, and highly saline. The sediments are thick and sticky, capable of swallowing equipment, tools, or bodies. The currents are unpredictable, and remnants of explosives from the war make every dive dangerous. For decades, private exploration was even banned, yet every so often new expeditions return to the lake with more advanced technology, seismic scanners, and unmanned submarines, and they always come back with more questions than answers. New objects have been found, but no loot has ever been located like the one some believe lies at the bottom. Is the treasure really there? Or was it a smokescreen created by the Nazis themselves to divert attention from its true destination? One line of thinking suggests that beyond the gold, the real value of what sank in toplets is information. Secret documents, evidence of clandestine operations, lists of collaborators, inventories of stolen goods, even reports on scientific experiments or technologies never revealed. And if that were true, who would have had an interest in ensuring that those documents never resurfaced? There are also darker theories. Some voices since the end of the war have suggested that some of those responsible for sinking the crates were never found, as if the operation had been managed by a parallel network with its own resources and objectives that went beyond the immediate conflict. Today, the lake remains as it always has been, dark, deep, impenetrable. The Austrian authorities have allowed some exploration, but strict surveillance remains in place, as if there was still something down there that must not be unearthed. What really lies beneath the waters of Lake Toplitz? A simple financial archive forgotten by time, or one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the Third Reich? Among the sunken roots of trees, the stones covered in silt, and the thick mud that hides every corner, the silence of the lake seems to speak. It does not scream, it does not warn, it just waits. Perhaps a treasure is not just gold or paper. Perhaps the real mystery lies in what human beings decide to hide and never look at again. From the dark waters of Lake Toplitz, where sealed boxes continue to hide the echo of a retreating Rick, the mystery now leads us to a more intimate office. It is not a battlefield or a secret base. It is a notebook, an everyday object with a worn leather cover and handwritten pages that could have contained the confessions, reflections, and warnings of one of the most feared and respected commanders of the 20th century, but which disappeared without explanation after his death. This is the enigma of General George S. Patton's lost diary. Patton was no ordinary officer. He stood out even among the titans of World War II. His character was fierce, controversial, often unpredictable. He spoke with a mixture of military brutality and ancestral spirituality. He believed in reincarnation. He was convinced that he had been a warrior in other lives, but he was also a brilliant strategist, responsible for some of the most decisive campaigns of the conflict, such as the liberation of Sicily, the containment of the Ardennes offensive, and the lightning advance into Germany. And as the end of the war drew nearer, Peyton began to show himself increasingly uncomfortable with the political decisions of the Allies. He openly criticized their passivity in the face of the Soviet threat. He spoke openly about corruption, betrayal, and the dangers that lay ahead after victory. In private conversations, he mentioned hidden documents, covert movements, and decisions made far from the front lines. To many, he was an uncomfortable general, a man who knew too much and was not afraid to speak his mind. And then the unexpected happened. On December 9th, 1945, weeks before returning to the United States, Peyton was involved in a traffic accident near Mannheim, Germany. His car was hit by a military truck. He was the only one seriously injured. 10 days later, he died in a hospital from a blood clot in his neck, an official diagnosis that has been accepted but never without reservations. Peyton had survived 2 world wars, multiple assassination attempts, explosions, and crossfire, yet he met his end at a crossroads under gray skies, far from the battlefield. His sudden silence fueled decades of theories, but the most puzzling part came later. The personal diary he kept throughout the war disappeared. It was not given to his family, it was not filed with his personal effects, nor was it incorporated into the U.S. military archive that carefully preserves the writings of senior officers. It simply vanished. Where is General Peyton's diary? And what could he have written in its final pages? His wife, Beatrice Peyton, publicly denounced its disappearance. She claimed that something was being hidden. Close friends said that the general had been writing intensely in the weeks before the accident, even jotting down names, dates, and decisions he considered scandalous. Some leaked excerpts speak of political betrayal within the Allied high command and his desire to expose certain truths upon his return to America. The diary may have contained evidence of internal conflicts between the victorious powers, accusations about the division of Europe after the fall of the Third Reich, references to secret negotiations with Nazi scientists or key figures in the defeated regime. The most persistent theories suggest that Peyton was about to become a critical voice against Soviet expansion, and that certain political and military sectors feared the effect his words could have on American public opinion. A living Peyton, with his charisma and access to sensitive information, could have rewritten the official post-war narrative. That is why some believe that the accident was not an accident, and that the diary, possibly confiscated at the hospital or at the crash site, was hidden, destroyed, or classified indefinitely. Too compromising, too dangerous. Others, with a less conspiratorial view, simply point out that the diary could have been lost in the administrative chaos at the end of the conflict, amid changes of command and general disorganization. But even that version is difficult to accept, given Peyton's position and the care with which the personal belongings of senior officers were documented. Today, some fragments of Peyton's earlier diaries have been published. They reflect his direct style, his tactical acumen, and his view of the conflict as not only a military struggle, but also a spiritual one. But the last pages, which he would have written between September and December 1945, remain missing. Where are they? In what forgotten box? In what archive locked away under 7 keys? Or perhaps in the hands of someone who considers them too revealing even today? Peyton's death closed a chapter, but the void left by his voice and the absence of his last written testimony continues to whisper in military corridors, incomplete libraries, and frustrated memories. What did Peyton mean before he died? And who decided that the world should not read it? Perhaps somewhere those words still wait to be read, not to change history, but to tell the part that has not yet been told. Following the disturbing disappearance of General Peyton's diary, where the missing words seem to hide a truth that was never written, the next mystery takes us back to the skies. But this time it is not a disappearance, but an impossible appearance. A warplane that landed without warning, without communication, without visible damage, and, most baffling of all, without a crew. The story took place on November 23, 1944, in the midst of World War II. The location was an airstrip near the Belgian town of Courtonville, used by Allied forces in recently liberated territory. It was a cold afternoon, the sky was overcast, and The atmosphere on the ground was routine, until suddenly, someone saw a B-17 flying fortress bomber approaching in the distance. This was not entirely unusual. That model was one of the most widely used by the USAF for strategic bombing missions, but something immediately caught the attention of those watching. The plane did not respond to radio calls, showed no signs of damage, and had not requested permission to land. As it approached, those watching from the base waited for some sign, a gesture from the cockpit, a radio message, an evasive maneuver. But nothing came. The plane descended in a strangely controlled manner, touched down gently, bounced once, and came to a stop. Silence. What followed was confusion. A group of soldiers approached cautiously, fearing an ambush or technical failure. When they opened the door, they found the plane completely empty. The 12 seats intended for the crew were unoccupied. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no blood. Everything was in its place. Partial documentation, even a copy of the flight path. The gun turrets were intact. The machine guns were mounted, but there was no sign of the men who should have been there. It had landed on its own. Was it even possible for a machine of that size, without human assistance, to make such a clean and controlled descent? Technicians confirmed that the engine had enough fuel, that the systems were functional, and that the plane had no significant structural damage. There were no visible bullet holes or signs of an emergency evacuation. The only irregularity was slight damage to one of the engines, which did not explain the total abandonment of the aircraft. Days later, after consulting flight records, the plane was identified. It belonged to the 91st Heavy Bombardment Squadron stationed in England. It had taken off on a mission that same day bound for Germany, but according to squadron reports, the B-17 in question never returned. It had been presumed lost in combat. So how did it end up in Belgium? And what happened to its crew? The official version, which was released some time later, suggested that the plane had suffered a serious malfunction in the middle of the mission. The crew, believing total failure to be imminent, had parachuted over Allied territory, and somehow the autopilot had kept the plane on course long enough for it to continue flying until it landed by inertia. But that explanation did not convince everyone. Several witnesses claimed that the descent was not chaotic or uncontrolled, but meticulously smooth. Furthermore, the complete list of crew members was never made public, nor was it confirmed that all of them had been found alive. In fact, some reports indicate that at least 2 of the alleged occupants never reappeared. And this is where the speculation begins. It could have been a covert experiment with autonomous navigation technology, a secret U.S. military test to study the feasibility of unmanned aircraft, or it was an emergency situation resolved so precisely that it bordered on the impossible. There are also those who suggest that there was something else, something that was not documented. What if the plane was abandoned not by accident, but by direct order after something was found on board? What if something was discovered inside, documents, technology, information that had to be kept secret? For years, the case was known as the Phantom Fortress. It has been mentioned in books, reports, and testimonies from veterans, always shrouded in a mixture of amazement and bewilderment. A brief episode, but one that challenges everything we know about air traffic control, navigation, and even logic. The plane was eventually dismantled and its parts used for spare parts. Today, there's no physical trace of that ghostly fuselage, only photographs, some official reports, and many questions. How could a bomber weighing more than 15 tons land without a pilot? Where are the crew members? And what else happened on board that silent aircraft before it touched down? In a conflict marked by figures, statistics, and strategic maneuvers, there are moments that defy explanation. Moments that do not appear in manuals or on maps. Moments that seem to whisper from another plane. Perhaps the fortress was not as ghostly as it seems. Perhaps no one simply wants to tell what they really saw after the silent landing of the Phantom Fortress, or an unmanned aircraft. Left more questions than answers. The next enigma takes us not to empty skies, but to one of the most enigmatic flights of the entire Second World War. A solitary, daring, and unexpected journey that ended in a Scottish field and whose purpose more than 80 years later, remains shrouded in a thick fog of secrets. We're talking about Rudolf Hess' flight to Scotland in May 1941. Rudolf Hess was not just any man within the Nazi apparatus. He was one of Hitler's first collaborators, his personal secretary, editor of the Mein Kampf, and in the official hierarchy of the Third Reich, he held the position of number 3 in the regime, just behind Göring. He was a man of power, trusted absolutely by the Führer, until he did something that no one saw coming. On the afternoon of May 10th, 1941, without warning, Hess boarded a specially modified Messerschmitt Bf 110 aircraft and took off alone from Augsburg, Germany. His destination was Scotland, the heart of the enemy. He traveled more than 100 kilometers across guarded skies, avoiding radar, and finally parachuted into the countryside near Glasgow. He was captured almost immediately by British farmers and handed over to the authorities. His mission, he said, was to negotiate peace between Germany and the United Kingdom. But none of this made sense, either to the British or the Germans. In Berlin, the news caused a real earthquake. Hitler was furious. The regime described Gess's actions as those of a mentally unstable individual. He was officially declared insane, and all ties with him were severed. But how could a man so closely linked to the core of power act alone, without any knowledge of the Führer, with access to a military plane and confidential documents? The British authorities, for their part, kept him in total isolation. He was interrogated, but the details were never made public. He was treated as a prisoner of war, then as a criminal, and finally convicted at the Nuremberg trials, not for crimes committed, but for his participation in the regime's leadership. He spent the rest of his life in prison, first in the United Kingdom and then in Spandau prison in Berlin. He died in 1987 after more than 40 years in solitary confinement. But what was Gess really looking for? His flight, which in theory was personal and without official backing, caused so much nervousness on both sides. A widely held theory holds that Gess was secretly sent by the Nazi regime with a peace offer to Churchill in a desperate attempt to avoid war on two fronts, just before the invasion of the Soviet Union. The aim would have been to convince the British to sign a favorable armistice and allow Germany to concentrate all its military efforts in the East. But if that was the mission, why do it without visible political backing? And why did the British government hide it so zealously? This is where the most disturbing hypotheses begin. Some historians and former intelligence agents claim that the British government knew in advance that Gess was coming and even facilitated his landing covertly. In fact, it has been documented that Gess was carrying with him the names of specific pro-German British nobles, such as the Duke of Hamilton, with whom he was allegedly planning to meet. There was an informal channel of negotiation between certain British elites and the Third Reich. Others go further and suggest that Gess was deceived, the victim of an intelligence operation designed to sow chaos within the Nazi regime. According to this version, the British used intermediaries or false messages to make Gess believe that there was a real interest on the part of London in negotiating peace, inciting him to act alone so that they could then capture him and humiliate Hitler from within. Be that as it may, much of the British files on this case remain classified, even today. Requests for declassification have been rejected on the grounds that publication could seriously affect national security. What could be so explosive about the flight of a single man if it was all, as they say, a personal folly with no consequences? For his part, Hess, in his few public moments during the Nuremberg trial, never denied the flight or showed remorse. But he refused to give detailed explanations, and during his decades in prison, he was the only prisoner in Spandau, for years on end, guarded by the 4 Allied powers, watched 24 hours a day, kept in isolation, a level of control that did not seem justified by his actions. Passed, but perhaps for what? He knew. He officially died by suicide, but there are those who claim he was murdered shortly before he could be released. Or speak. What was Rudolf Gess really carrying on his solo flight? A desperate message of peace or an attempt at a silent agreement that had to be buried forever? And why, after so many years, has the whole truth still not been told? As in so many episodes of World War II, the official story gives us one version. But between the unwritten pages, the orders that were not recorded, and the sealed documents, perhaps a failed pact lies hidden that could have changed the course of the war. From the lonely figure of Rudolf Hess descending over the fields of Scotland, carrying with him the weight of a message not fully understood, we now move to the vast Pacific Ocean, to one of the most crucial and obscure operations of the entire Second World War. A mission carried out in absolute secrecy, a lightning voyage that would change the course of history and a tragedy that for years left more questions than answers. We are talking about the USS Indianapolis, the American cruiser whose last mission and inexplicable end remained shrouded in mystery. It was July 1945. The war in Europe was over, but in the Pacific the conflict was intensifying. The fight against Japan continued with fierce intensity, and in the shadows, the United States was preparing its most extreme move, the use of a weapon never before used in combat, a bomb that would not only end the war, but also usher in a new era. It was then that the USS Indianapolis received its assignment. It set sail from San Francisco for the island of Tinian in the Marianas. On board, it carried essential components for the construction of the first atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima. According to documents declassified years later, the ship was carrying, among other things, the enriched uranium core and parts of the weapon's final assembly. It was a critical mission, but strangely discreet. The operation was so secret that no escort ships accompanied the cruiser. No communication was issued upon arrival at its destination, and no immediate report was sent when it disappeared. After completing its delivery, the USS Indianapolis set sail for the Philippines, and in the early morning of July 30th, 1945, it was hit by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine, the I-58. The ship broke in two and sank in less than 12 minutes. Of the approximately 1,960 men on board, approximately 900 survived the initial sinking. But for 5 days they floated in the open sea, without water or food, and exposed to one of the most horrific scenes of the entire war, constant shark attacks. In the end, only 316 were rescued alive. Why did it take so long to rescue them? The distress signals were not answered. Some messages were ignored. Others, according to later reports, never arrived. The Navy did not realize the ship was lost until a patrol plane spotted the survivors by chance. The horror of the tragedy was so shocking that it sparked a political and media storm. But beyond the negligence, the central question remained unanswered. Why was such an important operation carried out with so little protection? And what else was the USS Indianapolis really carrying? The official version is clear. It was transporting material for the Manhattan Project. But some researchers have pointed to unidentified cargo, strategic documents, experimental samples, and technology intended for further testing. Others suggest that the ship, in addition to its atomic cargo, may have been carrying diplomatic messages or instruments anticipating the imminent end of the war. There has even been speculation that there were agents on board traveling between key Pacific centers in a silent movement to prepare for the New World Order that would follow Japan's surrender. But the most persistent mystery remains that of its prolonged invisibility. Was it simply a logistical error or a chain of miscommunication in a war that was reaching its climax? Or was there an interest in ensuring that the ship and its mission were not tracked, even by the military command itself? The subsequent trial of the ship's captain, Charles B. McBay III, adds another layer of complexity. He was the only U.S. Navy officer ever to be tried and convicted for the loss of a ship in combat. However, years later, many survivors and analysts, including the Japanese submarine commander himself, defended his innocence. McBrayer was finally exonerated, but not before taking his own life in 1968, burdened with a guilt that many consider undeserved. Today, the wreckage of the Indianapolis lies at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, discovered in 2017 at a depth of more than 5,000 meters. Its structure lies in silence, far from trade routes, far from prying eyes, as if it still protects something that must not be told in its entirety. It was just a logistics ship, a victim of chance and bureaucracy in times of war. Or perhaps its sinking is part of a wider network of covert operations that we are only now beginning to understand. The USS Indianapolis was not just carrying a bomb, it was carrying a decision, and with its disappearance, questions that remain unanswered were also sunk. In the archives, in the silences of the reports, and in the eyes of the survivors. Perhaps the key still remains, but for now, all that emerges is a lingering doubt. What was the Indianapolis's last mission really? And why? Did no one else know? From the bottom of the Pacific, where the USS Indianapolis lies, guarding the secrets of its last mission, we now return to the invisible space of sound, not to the roar of engines or the explosion of explosives, but as something more subtle, more disturbing. An artificial whisper that travels through the ether without a signature, without a clear origin, throughout World War II and long after it. These signals were picked up by receivers around the world, always the same, always inexplicable. They're called numer stations or number stations. At first glance, they seem like insignificant broadcasts, a shortwave frequency accessible from any conventional radio. Suddenly, a neutral, almost robotic voice pronounces a sequence of numbers. 7249, sir. Sometimes the voice is that of a woman, sometimes a man. Sometimes children's music is heard before they begin, distorted songs, fragments of national anthems, and then the long numbers slow, repeated, without context, without explanation. The first time one of these stations was clearly detected was during World War II, when Allied radio operators began picking up these anomalous transmissions from various points in Europe. No one knew exactly where they were coming from, but it soon became clear that their function was neither civilian nor commercial, and that they were not intended to be understood by the general public. So who were they for? The most widely accepted theory, although never officially confirmed, is that these broadcasts were used by intelligence agencies to communicate with spies infiltrated behind enemy lines. The logic is both simple and brilliant. With a simple shortwave radio and a sheet of paper with a one-time code, an agent could receive orders, locations, and instructions without the need for complex antennas, leaving no trace and without compromising their position. The seemingly random numbers could not be deciphered without the corresponding key, and once the code was used, it was destroyed. Unidirectional communication, no response, no evidence, perfect for the dark times of war. But although the war ended in 1945, the stations did not disappear. On the contrary, they multiplied. During the Cold War, their presence increased. Transmissions were detected from Eastern Europe, Germany, the United Kingdom, Cuba, Russia, and the United States. Some broadcast in English, others in Russian, Czech, Spanish, and even Asian languages. Some operated 24 hours a day, others only at specific times in the early morning. Many used the same voices for years, even decades, without change or interruption. And even today, in the 21st century, some are still active. Who operates them? Who are they talking to? And why are they still operating? Especially when there are infinitely more sophisticated means of encrypted communication available today. This is where the mystery deepens. When asked about it, world governments deny knowledge of the existence of these broadcasts, or at best, claim that they are interference, frequency tests, or simple spectrum residue. However, some former intelligence agents have confirmed anonymously that number stations are real and functional, and that they remain useful for one fundamental reason. Radio cannot be traced, cannot be hacked, does not require a connection, just listening and taking notes. But there are other elements that have fueled growing speculation. On several occasions, number stations have changed their pattern after major geopolitical events. Minutes before covert military operations, regime changes, or even attacks, certain stations have broken years of silence to broadcast new sequences, as if they were alerts activated from an invisible chain of dormant commands. And then there are the more puzzling details. Some transmissions contain errors, as if the voice were reading live. There have been reports of stuttering, suppressed laughter, unscheduled pauses, signs that in some cases there was a human behind. The transmitter, not a machine. Could some stations still be active without anyone controlling their broadcasts? They are technological echoes repeating meaningless sequences from abandoned facilities, or, conversely, they remain living nodes of a global network that was never dismantled. Some enthusiasts have managed to triangulate the position of certain stations to remote locations, old government buildings, antennas in forgotten forests, deserted facilities. But every time a formal action to shut down or inspect them is attempted, the signals mysteriously cease, as if someone knows they are being watched and prefers to turn off the voice, at least for a while. Today, there are entire communities of radio amateurs monitoring these frequencies around the world. They archive, analyze, compare, but so far no one has managed to decipher the code without the original material. No one has publicly revealed a firm structure behind the numbers. Only patterns, repetitions, and disconnected fragments have been found. Like pieces of a puzzle with no reference image. What do these voices really say? And who listens to them from the other side of the world in silence with a notebook on the table? Number stations do not seek an audience. They do not demand attention. They just talk, broadcast, repeat, and perhaps that is what makes them so disturbing. Their existence is proof that something is still working in the shadows, something we cannot see, but which still pulses in the invisible spectrum of the air. Who is still broadcasting? And why? Perhaps the answer lies in the numbers themselves. Or perhaps, like so many things in times of war, it was designed to be heard but never understood. From the enigmatic sound of the number stations, signals that still travel across the spectrum like echoes of a war not quite over, we now turn to the southern tip of the American continent, to remote coastlines, windswept cliffs, and lonely bays where the sea beats with perpetual force. Places that seem timeless, isolated, but perhaps not as uninhabited as they seem. We're talking about the persistent mystery of a supposed Nazi submarine base in Argentina. The story begins shortly after the official end of the war in 1945. With the Third Reich reduced to rubble, hundreds of officers, scientists, collaborators, and war criminals began to mysteriously disappear from the map. While the Allies unearthed evidence, bodies, and documents in Europe, rumors began to surface in South America. German submarines had reached the South Atlantic coast long after the armistice. The place that attracted the most attention was a coastal area in southern Argentina, especially between Puerto Madryn, Necochea, Mar del Plata, and Peninsula Valdez. Inhospitable beaches, hard-to-reach cliffs, no radar. An ideal setting for a covert operation. What makes this story more than just a legend is the case of U-977 and the U-530. These two German submarines surrendered to the Argentine authorities in July and August 1945, weeks, even months after the war had ended in Europe. The question that no one could answer at the time was immediate. Where had they been all that time? Both captains offered inconsistent accounts. They spoke of slow journeys, personal decisions, changes of course to avoid conflict, even ideological motives. But the truth is that neither submarine showed signs of severe deterioration, as would be expected after long weeks at sea. Their crews were in good condition. And most curiously, no one ever knew for sure what or who they had been transporting. This fueled a theory that refuses to die, that somewhere remote off the Argentine coast there is or was a support base for Nazi submarines, built in secret in the last years of the war and intended to serve as an escape route for senior regime officials. And the story does not end at sea. In areas of the Argentine interior, especially in Patagonia, testimonies began to emerge of unusual German presence, heavily guarded private facilities, entire villages that spoke exclusively German, sightings of figures recognized from photographs, and persistent reports that certain Nazi leaders were living under new identities. The case of Adolf Eichmann, captured in Buenos Aires in 1960, and Joseph Mengele, seen on multiple occasions in the region, reinforced that narrative. But what takes the enigma to another level is the physical and documentary evidence. In the 1950s, Some local fishermen reported seeing partially submerged concrete structures near certain coves inaccessible by land. Others spoke of tunnels carved into the rock, visible only at low tide. And there were even those who claimed to have seen German ships unloading materials and people in the middle of the night, protected by local patrols. Despite attempts to confirm these stories officially, no such base was ever found, at least not openly. Some independent explorers and researchers have scoured the coast with sonar equipment, underwater cameras, and thermal sensors. And while they have found geological anomalies, no definitive explanation has ever been given. What sense would it make to build a base on one of the most isolated corners of the planet? This is where the deepest speculation comes in. Some argue that it was not just an escape route, but a center of reorganization intended to preserve technology, key people, and long-term plans in case of defeat of the Reich. A place where ideology could survive the war, where the Third Reich could mutate and wait. There are also theories linking these shelters to missing documentation from the Kronos project, or even to the remains of Diglok, the alleged Nazi dome developed as an energy weapon or even a time manipulation device. Key pieces were transported to South America. Attempts were made to continue secret research there. In 2012, an investigation by Argentine and German historians accessed declassified files indicating that at least 6 unidentified German submarines had sailed from Norway in April 1945 with an unknown destination and were never intercepted or reported as sunk. To this day, their fate remains a mystery. So the question remains, was there really a Nazi submarine base on the Argentine coast? Or is it all the result of a mixture of post-war mythology, collective fear, and historical gaps? Perhaps the most disturbing thing is what has not been said, because despite the years, the investigations, and the testimonies, no one has wanted to close the door completely. And in some corner of the coast where the sea beats hard and the wind covers any traces, the past could still be hidden, waiting to be discovered. What else arrived in those submarines? And what was left behind, hidden beneath the waves? From the remote southern coasts of Argentina, where suspicions of ghost submarines and Third Reich escape plans still echo, we now move on to one of the darkest, most silenced, and most puzzling episodes of the end of World War II. The third atomic bomb that was never dropped. Imagine the deathly silence of the New Mexico desert at dawn on July 16, 1945. An arid, desolate, motionless vastness, and then suddenly a light brighter than 1,000 suns. At that moment, the nuclear age was born. The Manhattan Project had been successfully completed, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to change forever. Weeks later, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be wiped out by atomic bombs, causing unprecedented devastation. But what few remember, and even fewer understand, is that there was a third bomb ready, assembled, waiting for orders. Its assembly began even before the second bomb was dropped. The model was similar to Fatman, the bomb that fell on Nagasaki: plutonium, an implosion core, and precision detonators. According to military records, the bomb was scheduled to be dropped on August 19, 1945, on a third Japanese city, which had not yet been confirmed. Some sources mention Kokura, others point to Niigata. There are even those who claim that Tokyo was on the preliminary list as a final act of total deterrence. But the war ended on August 15th after the surrender of Emperor Hirohito. So that third bomb was never dropped, or so we believe. The truth is that although the surrender put an end to the bombings, preparation for the launch of the third bomb continued for several days. According to U.S. Army documents, the weapon was partially transported to the base at Tinian in the Pacific, the same place from which the planes carrying the 2 previous bombs took off, but from there everything becomes unclear. Some reports claim that the bomb was dismantled and its components reused for subsequent tests. Others maintain that the entire bomb was stored in a secret facility and never actually deactivated. Rumors about its whereabouts have circulated for decades. Some say it was buried in an underground base in Nevada. Others say it was secretly sent to Europe to balance the Soviet threat in the post-war period. There are even theories that the bomb was loaded onto a submarine and sent to an undisclosed destination, ready to be used if Japan reneged on its surrender. These hypotheses, while unverified, are fueled by an even more disturbing reality. The United States never officially revealed what happened to the third bomb. There are no images or public records of its dismantling, nor any inventory documenting its destruction. It is possible that, fearing future escalation, they decided to keep it operational as a tool of pressure. We must also consider the political dimension. In the days following the Japanese surrender, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to escalate. Some historians believe that the third bomb could have been part of a hidden message, an unplayed card, intended not for defeated Japan, but for the vigilant Kremlin. A silent warning, as powerful for its absence as for its possible use. But the mystery deepens when we consider the documents declassified in recent decades. Among them are vague references to an incomplete nuclear shipment with an unknown destination. Others mention a special unit tasked with keeping an atomic device that was not part of the Nevada tests or the subsequent strategic arsenal in working order. Was it that third bomb or something even more advanced, a prototype that never saw the light of day? Some researchers even link the disappearance of this bomb to unexplained nuclear accidents in the 1950s and 1960s, both on U.S. territory and in Alta. March. It may have been used, tested in secret, or lost in a covert operation. The official story is limited to silence. There are no firm reports, no public acknowledgments, only fragments, memos, witnesses who are no longer with us, and questions that refuse to go away. And so, at the heart of the atomic narrative of World War II beats a void, a bomb that was manufactured, assembled, and never dropped. A weapon that, while it did not fall from the sky, changed history by its mere existence. What does it really mean that it was never used? Was it a strategic decision or an opportunity kept on the back burner in case history took a different turn? Perhaps the real question is not where that bomb is, but whether we ever stop preparing to use it. And while the world remembers Hiroshima and Nagasaki, somewhere in the forgotten memory of war, the echo of an explosion that never happened but could have changed everything remains. From the ominous silence of the hangars where weapons that could have changed the fate of the world were stored, we now turn to an accident that, although it occurred in clear skies and under apparent normality, left behind a shadow of suspicion that never dissipated. A death that to this day remains shrouded in secrets and contradictions. We go back to July 4th, 1943, to the island of Gibraltar, to General Władysław Sikorski's last flight. It was a quiet night. The Mediterranean stretched out like a dark mirror beneath the wings of the B-24. Liberator AL-523, a British plane that had taken off calmly from the military runway in Gibraltar. On board was the Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile, one of the British's main allies, a man who embodied the hope of a free Poland despite the Nazi occupation. With him were his daughter, trusted officers, diplomats, and the RAF pilot, who was reputed to be experienced. But just 16 seconds after takeoff, the plane crashed into the sea. It sank quickly. Only the pilot survived. At first glance, it all looked like an accident, a technical failure, a mechanical error. The hastily drafted official British report concluded that the cause of the crash could not be determined with certainty, although sabotage was ruled out. However, doubts began to mount. Why were most of the bodies, including that of the general's daughter, not recovered? Why was the pilot, the sole survivor, sent to Canada and kept away from public contact for years? And why did the British government refuse for decades to declassify the complete documents of the case? The circumstances of the accident immediately aroused suspicion among Poles in exile. Sikorski was not just any figure. He was an uncomfortable leader for many, especially after demanding explanation from Stalin for the K massacre, where thousands of Polish officers were killed by the Soviet NKVD in 1940. His firmness towards Moscow contrasted with the growing British desire to maintain fluid relations with the USSR, which had become a key ally on the Eastern Front. Was his death convenient? Some believe so. And there is no shortage of theories pointing to the Soviets' desire to eliminate a voice that openly questioned their legitimacy. Other more subtle versions point to possible British complicity or at least an act of omission to allow the Soviets to solve the problem without getting their hands dirty. Beyond speculation, there are concrete elements that fuel the mystery. In 2008, Sikorsky's body was exhumed in Poland and analyzed by a forensic team. What they found was surprising. There were no signs of impact consistent with a fall from a height or fractures typical of a plane crash. This led to new questions. Did he really die in the accident, or was he murdered before boarding? In addition, several Polish witnesses in exile claimed to have seen suspicious movements in the days leading up to the flight, sudden changes in the crew, unregistered luggage, and discreet visits by British officers to the airbase. Nothing conclusive, but all disturbing. There has even been speculation that Sikorsky never boarded the plane and that his death was faked as part of a covert operation. This theory, although extreme, has been supported by partially declassified documents in recent years showing intense activity by British and Soviet secret services in Gibraltar during the same period. Other investigators, however, point to an internal conflict within the Polish government in exile. Sikorsky had created divisions with certain military and political sectors, especially those who favored a partial reconciliation with Moscow. He may have been the victim of a betrayal from within. More than 80 years after the accident, there is still no consensus. The official story maintains the accident version, although it admits that some elements remain unclear. Modern investigations, both in Poland and the United Kingdom, continue to come up against walls of silence and still classified archives. And so General Sikorsky remains a doubly tragic figure, a martyr of an occupied homeland and the unwitting protagonist of one of the most persistent conspiracies of the 20th century. What secrets accompanied that flight? Who really had something to gain from his death? Was it an accident or a carefully disguised execution? The sea that swallowed him still holds his story. And perhaps in some forgotten office, in a sealed file, or in the memory of a witness who is no longer with us, lies the answer that the world has not yet wanted to hear. From the murky waters of broken alliances and unsolved deaths, we now enter the infinite void of the desert, a place where time dissolves into sand and secrets are hidden beneath dunes that do not speak. There, between the silence and the relentless sun, an almost intact plane appeared, as if it had landed on its own, as if waiting to be found. Its name was painted in elegant letters. On the fuselage, Lady Bud. April 1943. A squadron of B-24 Liberator bombers took off from a base in Libya bound for Naples, Italy. Among them was the Lady Bud on its first combat mission. A crew of 9 well-trained young men were confident they would return after the night operation. But that plane never returned. For years, it was thought that it had been shot down somewhere in the Mediterranean or had exploded in flight. No wreckage, no signals, no emergency transmissions were ever found. It simply disappeared. In the midst of war, losses were so frequent that no one investigated too much. But in 1958, 15 years after the end of the conflict, a British oil expedition flying over the Sahara Desert, more than 700 kilometers south of its planned route, spotted the wreckage of a surprisingly well-preserved aircraft. It was the Lady Bigud. The paint was still visible. The propellers were twisted from the impact, but the fuselage remained intact. There were even bottles of water and unopened military rations in the cabin. How had it got there? Why had no distress signal been received? And what had happened to the men on board? The answers did not come immediately. The discovery triggered a series of investigations by the U.S. military, which quickly identified the aircraft thanks to its serial numbers. It was soon confirmed. It was the same plane that had disappeared in 1943. But then a second mystery emerged. The crew was not in the plane. Months later, search teams began to find human remains scattered across the desert dozens of miles from the crash site. Based on the diaries and personal items recovered, investigators pieced together a story as heartbreaking as it was puzzling. The bomber, lost in the darkness after its aborted mission, had flown over its base without recognizing it, probably due to poor visibility and lack of reference points. Convinced that they were still over the sea, they continued flying south in search of land, unaware that they were entering one of the most inhospitable deserts in the world. When the fuel ran out, the crew jumped out with their parachutes. All survived the landing, but that was when the real struggle began. With no idea where they were, no signals, no shade, and not enough water, they began a desperate march north, believing that the coast could not be far away. One by one, they died in the vastness of the desert under scorching temperatures during the day and freezing temperatures at night. One of the diaries found recounts how the men survived for 8 days, walking more than 100 kilometers before succumbing to heat, thirst, and exhaustion. But even this reconstructed story leaves questions unanswered. Why didn't the plane send any distress signals? The B-24s were equipped with long-range radios. Was there an electrical failure, or was it deliberately disconnected? Why was the fuselage so well preserved while the human remains were so scattered? And most disturbingly, one of the bodies was found more than 150 kilometers from the aircraft, as if it had continued a lonely march far beyond its companions. Why? What did it hope to find? Some theorists have suggested that the crew may have survived longer than estimated, and even that they were seen by nomadic tribes who never reported the discovery. There are those who claim that certain personal items recovered were not officially returned and may have revealed more than the U.S. military was willing to acknowledge. There are even those who, carried away by the tragic symbolism of the case, see the Lady Big Goodud as more than just an accident, a metallic specter trapped in time, as if the desert had wanted to preserve it as a silent testimony to a war that did not end with combat, but with disorientation, human error, and the most brutal loneliness. Today, what remains of Lady Big Goodud has been removed from the desert. Some fragments are preserved in museums, others remain stored in military bases. The story has been told many times, but each new version adds a nuance, a detail, a doubt. Can an airplane fly beyond its destination and disappear from history for 15 years? And what does it really mean to be lost? When the echo of footsteps marked in the sand in search of a salvation that never came can still be heard, the Lady Big Goodud remains a time capsule, a silent warning, a mystery that, despite being partially solved, still invites us to look at the desert horizon with a question on our lips. What else does the sand hide from us? Along the Pacific coast, from the mountains of Oregon to the plains of Western Canada, there are records of a phenomenon that seems straight out of a science fiction novel. Between 1944 and 1945, inhabitants of remote regions began to find strange objects that had fallen from the sky. Rice paper spheres, loose strings, fragments of fabric, and charred metal structures. No one knew where they came from or what purpose they served. But what appeared to be an isolated oddity turned out to be part of a secret Japanese operation, as bold as it was baffling. The Fugo bomb balloons. The name Fugo can be translated as floating weapon, and that is what these seemingly fragile objects made of handmade Japanese paper were. These balloons were designed with a precision that defied their simple appearance. They incorporated barometers, altitude sensors, and self-destruction mechanisms. But the most unusual thing was their range. The Fugo were the first intercontinental weapon in history. Launched from Japan, they traveled thousands of kilometers on the Pacific jet stream in the hope of causing fires, fear, and chaos in the heart of the enemy. It is estimated that Japan launched more than 9,000 balloons toward North America. Of these, about 300 reached U.S. and Canadian territory. Some are found in remote forests. Others exploded near ranches or in rural areas. One balloon reached the state of Michigan. Another fell in Mexico, but most disturbingly, the vast majority were never found. How is such a technical feat possible during a war marked by limited resources? And why has so little been said about it? In theory, the aim was to cause massive forest fires and force the U.S. government to divert troops and resources from the Pacific Front. The weapon was in part psychological, attacking without a face, without noise, without presence. A weapon launched into the wind, literally. But the truth is that the military effectiveness of the Fugos was limited. Many balloons never arrived. Others landed in wet or snowy areas where they could not cause damage. Even so, there were victims. In May 1945, in Bliley, Oregon, 6 people, a pregnant woman and 5 children, died while handling what they believed to be a harmless object that had fallen among the trees. It was the only enemy attack that caused deaths on U.S. mainland soil during World War II. Paradoxically, this tragic event was hushed up by the authorities. Why? Because the government feared that if news of these balloons spread, the Japanese would think their strategy was working and launch more. For months, the press remained silent. Forest patrols were increased. The balloons that were detected were secretly deactivated, their remains collected and transported away from the public. Even today, there are areas where pieces of Fugo balloons have been found in surprisingly well-preserved condition. But beyond the known facts, the mystery persists. How did the Japanese manage to build these balloons with so little advanced technology? Was there some hidden purpose beyond environmental sabotage? Some researchers have suggested that certain balloons carried undocumented payloads, perhaps intended for espionage or covert scientific testing. Others argue that there were balloons with more advanced navigation systems than those officially described. Technology that would later disappear without a trace. And then there's the most disturbing question of all. Where are the Fugo balloons that were never found? Sporadic discoveries have been reported even decades after the end of the war. In 2014, a forest maintenance crew in Canada discovered one underground, intact and still assembled. This implies that some balloons are still out there, dormant, hidden by vegetation, or buried by time. They could still pose a risk, or they could simply be relics of a war that was partly fought with invisible weapons. Fugo balloons are an example of how conflicts are not always fought with tanks and armies, but with ideas, fear, and silence. A threat suspended in the sky, moved by the wind, without a pilot or direction, a gamble on absolute chance. And perhaps that is the most disturbing thing. Not their design, not their purpose, but the fact that to this day we still do not know how many arrived or how many are still there, and if one of them is still floating in some forgotten corner of the forest. And if the real mystery is not the damage they caused, but the message they wanted to send. To what extent can a nation wage war with its hopes literally thrown to the wind? Only time and a land that still hides its secrets hold the answer. In a gloomy room in the south of England, surrounded by cables, coded papers, and buzzing machines, a small group of men and women worked in silence. The walls were cold, the air tense. That place was called Bletchley Park. It did not appear on maps, and those who passed through its gates knew that what happened there must remain in the shadows, because it was there. In that inconspicuous corner of the country, one of the most secret battles of the entire war was being fought, the struggle to crack the Enigma machine code. The Enigma was not a simple typewriter. With its multiple rotors, cables, and variable configurations, it generated encrypted messages with a level of complexity that the Nazis considered indecipherable. Every day, its configurations changed, creating more than 150 million billion possible combinations. For many, it was literally unbreakable, and yet it was broken. But here begins the mystery. We know that mathematicians such as Alan Turing, together with Polish and British cryptography experts, managed to crack the Enigma code. We know that thanks to this, the Allies obtained vital information that shortened the war. What we do not know for sure is how, and when many of these codes were intercepted, was it just a matter of mathematical genius, or were there other pieces of the puzzle that were never made public? Among the documents declassified over the years are references to interceptions that do not quite add up. Some Enigma keys were apparently obtained before the machine was completely deciphered. On other occasions, the speed with which the interceptions were made suggests that the Allies already knew what the messages said before they came into their possession. A particularly intriguing episode occurred with the capture of U-110 in 1941. The British boarded the German submarine and found an intact Enigma machine along with codebooks. However, this operation was kept secret from the public for years. And the most curious thing is that the information obtained from this capture was not used immediately. Why? Was it to avoid alerting the Nazis? Or because there was already another, even more secret way of obtaining those codes? Some historians have put forward unofficial theories. What if the Allies had access to information from within Germany itself? And what if Enigma was not defeated solely by calculation and logic, but by betrayal in the shadows? There has also been talk of the intervention of external intelligence services, including alleged operations in Switzerland or Scandinavia, where spies allegedly intercepted early versions of the code, and others, even more daring, have raised the possibility of experimental listening and tracking technologies developed in secret. The fact is that there are still some pieces that don't fit. How is it possible that certain Allied operations were so precise in anticipating Nazi movements that they should not have known about? How did they manage to hide for so long that they were reading daily messages from the German High Command? Even among Bloody Park's own workers, there are those who never knew the real origin of some of the intercepted messages. They were given fragments, asked to solve algorithms, but never told who had provided the initial information. And perhaps that was the most brilliant and disturbing thing about it. A network so secret that even its own members did not fully understand what they were building. Today, decades later, the Enigma machine is on display in museums as a symbol of an era of ingenuity and shadows. But the real Enigma may not lie within its metal rotors, but in the corridors of still classified archives. Do we really know the whole truth about how those messages were intercepted? Or is there still a part of the story locked away behind keys that no one has wanted to open? Perhaps one day it will be revealed. Perhaps not, because in a war where every word could change the fate of millions, even silences were carefully coded. In a U.S. military base, under the artificial light of sealed files and numbered boxes, lie documents with black marks and illegible signatures, typed sheets where names have been erased, reports censored, and dates vaguely altered. Among those papers begins a story that still today makes the history of Operation Paperclip uncomfortable. After the surrender of the Third Reich in 1945, the Allies faced a new reality. The Nazi threat was over, but the world was no safer. As atomic bombs marked the beginning of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union entered a desperate race for knowledge and control of the future. And in the middle of that chessboard was a coveted piece, the scientists of the Reich. Who were these men? Engineers, physicists, doctors. Many of them had worked directly on Nazi military programs, developing rockets, chemical weapons, and, according to some reports, human experiments. Operation Paperclip, secretly named by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, was designed to quietly transfer hundreds of these German specialists to U.S. territory. They were offered new identities, immunity from prosecution, and employment contracts, all in exchange for their knowledge. Among them, the best known was Werner von Braun, chief engineer of Hitler's B-2 program. Under his leadership, the Nazis bombarded London with supersonic rockets. A decade later, von Braun became the architect of the U.S. space program and a familiar face at NASA. But von Braun was just the tip of the iceberg. Declassified documents, although many remain hidden, today reveal a long and ambiguous list. Some names were linked to war crimes, others to ethically unacceptable experiments. But that did not prevent them from being integrated into laboratories, secret bases, and classified projects. And here the mystery begins. Why were so many files hidden for decades? Why are certain documents still sealed today for reasons of national security? One of the murkiest aspects of Operation Paperclip is the contrast between what is known and what has been deliberately omitted. In many files, sections relating to the scientists' Nazi activities were removed. New biographies were written, backgrounds were whitewashed, and they were presented as technical experts with no ties to the regime. Was it really for geopolitical pragmatism, or was there something else? Some researchers have suggested that certain scientists participated in even darker projects than those officially recognized. There is testimony pointing to secret developments in biotechnology, mind control, and human experimentation, even within U.S. territory. It is possible that experimental Nazi technologies were the basis for later projects such as MK Ultra, and what other collaborations remain under the veil of secrecy. Also striking is the way in which the public image of these men was protected. While the world was trying war criminals in Nuremberg, others with similar ties were being flown discreetly to bases, such as Fort Biss or White SS. There they began a new life, often under false names, without ever having to answer for what happened during the conflict. And it wasn't just in the United States. The OSS carried out a parallel operation, recruiting Nazi scientists for its own ballistic and atomic program, which raises another uncomfortable question. To what extent was the post-war period a continuation of the war by other means? The very existence of Operation Paperclip was denied for years, only with the partial declassification of documents in the 1970s did some details begin to emerge, but the information remains fragmented. Many pieces are still missing, and what we already know raises more questions than it answers. Today, the laboratories where these men worked have changed their names. Their reports lie in dusty archives or on servers protected by security protocols, but the questions remain unanswered. Was the price of scientific progress too high? And what secrets remain buried, protected by silence, bureaucracy, and fear? Perhaps within the pages of those hidden files lies not only the history of an operation, but also the uncomfortable reflection of a choice, that of sacrificing truth for strategic advantage. And in that choice, there may still be things we are not ready to discover. Across the Arctic, where the sea melts into ice and the fog seems never to dissipate, there is a silent route that during World War II became a deadly passage. In those icy waters between Iceland and the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk sailed convoy PQ-17, a flotilla of merchant ships escorted by warships, loaded with weapons, vehicles, and vital supplies for the Eastern Front. But what should have been a strategic mission turned into one of the most baffling naval disasters of the conflict. It was July 1942. Convoy PQ-17, consisting of 35 merchant ships and an escort of destroyers, cruisers, and anti-aircraft ships, set sail for the Soviet Union as part of the military aid agreement between the Allies. They knew the journey was dangerous. German air patrols watched the skies. U-boats lurked beneath the surface. And from Norway, the German battleship Tirpitz, one of the greatest threats to the Allied Navy, could spring into action at any moment. On July 4th, something changed. An order was issued from London that is still debated today. Scatter the convoy. It was feared that the Tirpitz had set sail to intercept it. The escorts abandoned the merchant ships, which were left at the mercy of the sea and the enemy. Over the next few days, the convoy was wiped out. Of the 35 ships, only 11 made it to their destination. The U-boats and German planes attacked mercilessly, sinking cargo ships, destroying lives, and leaving behind a field of icy wreckage. But beyond the military tragedy, there is something about the story of PQ-17 that does not quite add up. Why was such a risky decision made based on a movement by the Tirpitz that, as it later transpired, never happened? Was it really a threat, or was it a covert maneuver? Official documents speak of an intelligence error, of false signals being intercepted, of the danger being exaggerated. However, some historians are not convinced. There are theories that the target was elsewhere, that certain ships in the convoy were not only carrying weapons, but also classified material, possibly technological, perhaps even linked to Soviet research prior to the conflict. Others suggest that the dispersal was deliberate, that PQ-17 was used as a distraction to cover up the movement of another smaller but more important convoy. An operation within an operation, a carefully planned tactical sacrifice. The testimonies of the surviving sailors also add layers to the mystery. Some speak of contradictory signals, messages arriving too late, unexplained changes of course. There are even those who claim to have seen strange lights in the Arctic sky during the attacks, although this may be more attributable to the confusion of battle than to any real phenomenon. And then there are the unpublished reports, files that remain sealed in the British Admiralty archives to this day. Surveillance reports, intercepted communications, altered maps. Why keep secret the details of an operation that was officially a mistake? Even the exact fate of some ships remains unknown. Wrecks that never appeared, bodies that were never recovered, cargoes that disappeared without a trace. What exactly sank in the cold waters of the Barents Sea? And why does no one seem to want to recover it? In the years after the war, the story of PQ-17 was treated with shame, an example of strategic failure. But little by little, with the publication of personal diaries, declassified fragments, and interviews with former commanders, the narrative became murkier, more complex, more disturbing. Today, the bottom of the Arctic Sea holds its secrets. The rusted hulls of the ships, covered in seaweed and ice, remain there like time capsules that no one has wanted to open completely. What will we see if we did? Perhaps a story that is more human than political. Perhaps a truth that is more uncomfortable than it is clarifying, or perhaps simply a mistake, one of those mistakes that change the course of history and leave a trail of doubts that are impossible to dispel. Was the PQ-17 the victim of a non-existent threat? Or are there still pieces of the puzzle that no one has wanted to put together? The waters remain still, and so does the silence in the dark, icy waters of the Baltic Sea or the fog. Or are there still pieces of the puzzle that no one has wanted to put in place? The waters remain still, as does the silence in the dark, icy waters of the Baltic Sea, where the fog hangs low and the winter winds whistle with a deathly silence. Here lies one of the most tragic and forgotten shipwrecks in modern history. The Wilhelm Gustloff, a German ocean liner converted into an evacuation ship, has been submerged beneath the waves since January 1945. Its story, although overshadowed by other tragedies of war, hides questions that remain unanswered and wounds that never fully healed. It was a freezing night on January 30th. The ship, originally built as a symbol of Nazi power and pride in the German fleet, set sail from Gotenhafen, Eugenia, in Poland bound for Aquila. There were no tourists or dignitaries on board, only refugees. Thousands of German civilians were fleeing the advance of the Red Army. Women, children, wounded soldiers, nurses, even some SS officers. The official estimate was just over 6,000 people. Others claim there were more than 10,000. Not all of them are listed in the records. Some simply boarded the ship without documentation, with only the clothes on their backs, seeking one last hope. Barely a day had passed on the high seas when, in the middle of the night, a Soviet submarine, the S-13 commanded by Alexander Marinesko, spotted the Wilhelm Gustloff. 3 torpedoes were enough. The first hit the bow, the second near the pool area. The third hit the engine room. The ship went down in just 45 minutes. The figures are shocking. More than 9,000 people died, most of them women and children. This far exceeds the Titanic or the Lusitania. However, its name barely appears in school books or memorials. Why? Some say it was a legitimate act of war. The ship was carrying troops and military equipment. It was not identified as a hospital ship nor protected by the Geneva Convention. Others, however, insist that it was a massacre, a crime silenced by both sides. The Soviets, because it was not convenient to glorify a German civilian tragedy. The Germans, because acknowledging it would have been admitting imminent collapse. But there is more. Some voices maintain that the Wilhelm Gustloff was not only carrying refugees. There are vague, classified, or simply destroyed reports that point to the possibility that the ship was transporting looted treasures, art stolen from Polish and Soviet museums, even secret archives, of the Ahnenerbe or experimental technology. What disappeared with it under the waters of the Baltic? In the years following the conflict, some expeditions were attempted. Divers reported scattered debris, collapsed structures, bodies still trapped between the cabins. But very soon the Polish government declared the area a maritime cemetery, prohibiting any rescue or recovery operations. Respect for the dead was invoked, but some believe there is more to it. What is hidden in the rusty holds of the Wilhelm Gustav? What files? What evidence? What pieces of the puzzle of war and its secrets sank with it? Was it just a civilian tragedy or a tactical sinking carried out with knowledge of what it was carrying? Even the captain of the Soviet submarine was curiously punished after the mission. He was not decorated, and the operation was not celebrated. Marinesco was removed, demoted, and only rehabilitated decades later. Why was what was theoretically a clear military victory not recognized at the time? To this day, the hull of the Wilhelm Gustloff lies in silence, covered in seaweed, silt, and decades of secrets. Only a few images of the wreck have been released. Most underwater explorations have been superficial, limited, or blocked for diplomatic reasons. The remaining survivors, now elderly, recount scenes of horror, despair, and absolute chaos in the middle of the coldest night of the year. Some remember seeing armed soldiers preventing access to certain areas of the ship. Others speak of closed, sealed boxes being lowered into the holds in the middle of the night. We may never know for sure what was really on board. Perhaps it was just a ship overflowing with fear, escaping the end of the Third Reich. Or perhaps it was something more, a last resort transport carrying something that must not fall into enemy hands. It is possible that the true secrets of the Wilhelm Gustloff are still there under the ice, waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps it is precisely this silence, this lack of information, that gives it its disturbing power. In any case, the sea does not speak, but keeps secrets, and the Wilhelm Gustloff remains a closed capsule from the end of an era, and a reminder that even in defeat, mysteries never sink completely. Deep in the Ural Mountains, where the wind cuts like knives and snow covers the landscape like an eternal veil, there is a place that many consider cursed. It is called Kolit Syakhl in the Mansi language, the Mountain of the Dead. There, in February 1959, 9 Soviet hikers lost their lives in such strange circumstances that even today, more than 6 decades later, there is no conclusive explanation. But what many do not know is that there are those who believe that this enigma, known as the Dyatlov Pass incident, could have deeper roots. Perhaps even the secrets still buried from World War II. The bodies were found scattered in the snow, some half-naked, others with internal fractures and no external signs of trauma, and one without a tongue. The tent had been slashed from the inside. The watches had stopped. The fear on their faces was evident. From the outset, investigators were faced with an impossible scene. Avalanche, animal attack, collective psychosis. No explanation seemed to fit, and among the many theories, an even more disturbing line of thinking emerged, that these young people could have been accidental witnesses to something they should not have seen. What was a group of students doing in such a remote and desolate area, right in the heart of an old corridor used decades earlier for secret military tests? Why were there reports of strange lights in the sky on the night of their deaths? And why, according to certain declassified files, had the site already been used in the 1940s for highly classified experimentation? During the final months of World War II, the Soviet government intensified its efforts to capture German technology. The Soviet project, known as Operation Osoabia, after the war, moved hundreds of German scientists to the heart of the USSR. Some of them worked on projects related to sonic weaponry, radiation, and unconventional atmospheric phenomena. The Urals were the perfect place, remote, inaccessible, forgotten. It is possible that Nazi devices were tested in colloidal artifacts brought by scientists who, as in the U.S., Operation Paperclip, were secretly integrated. Some unconfirmed reports mention a surveillance post near the area in the 1940s, camouflaged as a weather station. According to later testimonies, the Red Army sealed off nearby areas immediately after the bodies were found in 1959. What were they trying to hide? Another theory suggests the presence of radioactive weapons. Several of the bodies showed signs of contamination, which was never satisfactorily explained. It could be residue from tests carried out in previous years or an accident, a chance encounter with active war technology forgotten in the snow. Furthermore, some files from the NK-BOB, the predecessor of the KKGB, mention sightings of test balloons and unidentified aerial vehicles in the region during the post-war period. There is even speculation about a possible connection with the Soviet Raketoplin project, an ambitious program of hypersonic vehicles whose origins, according to some sources, date back to unfinished prototypes from the Third Reich. The coincidences do not end there. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Nazis had already shown interest in remote regions for their occult research. They are known to have sent expeditions to the Himalayas, the Arctic, and, according to rumors, even Siberia. It is not far-fetched to think that the Soviets inherited not only their technology, but also their obsessions. And so, the inevitable question arises, did those young people die of natural causes? Or were they accidental victims of a hidden legacy of war? A piece of lost technology, a covert experiment, or something that no one dared to describe in official reports? Today, the Dyatlov Pass is a place of pilgrimage for conspiracy theorists and the curious alike. But beneath every layer of snow, beneath every stone moved by the wind, there lingers the shadow of a secret that may not belong entirely to 1959, but to an even darker time. Was the Dyatlov Pass the unresolved epilogue of a war that never really ended? Or is it just another echo of the eternal struggle between what is known and what we were never meant to know? Perhaps the truth is buried under the snow, or perhaps it has always been right before our eyes, but shrouded in the language of official denial, of sealed files, of silence imposed by those who guard the secrets of the most devastating war in history. In the remotest reaches of the vast Siberian taiga, where the trees stretch out like a green ocean that seems to have no end, there is a scar on the earth that still baffles scientists more than a century later. It is an inhospitable, silent region marked by a devastating event that remains unexplained to this day. On June 30th, 1908, an explosion rocked Tunguska, destroying more than 2,000 square kilometers of forest. The trees fell as if an invisible hand had swept them from the sky, all pointing in the same direction, as if pointing to the origin of something inexplicable. The curious thing is that no crater was found. There were no visible metal debris or rock fragments, only charred trees, dead animals, and a thick silence that still hangs over the area. Native accounts spoke of a fireball crossing the sky, followed by a shock wave that shook houses hundreds of kilometers away. A meteorite, a volcanic explosion, or something completely different. For decades, science tried to provide a logical explanation. The most widely accepted hypothesis has been that of a meteoroid that exploded in the atmosphere at low altitude. But this theory, although plausible, does not resolve all the unknowns. Why have no clear traces of nickel or iron, typical of meteorites, been found? And how can we explain the strange mutations in the surrounding vegetation that were recorded in the decades that followed? Or the temporary increase in radiation that some researchers detected in the soil? This is where the story begins to intertwine with the darkest secrets of the 20th century. Starting in the 1930s, both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany began to take an interest in Tunguska. There are records, albeit incomplete, of scientific expeditions sent by both sides before and during World War II. What exactly were they looking for in that forgotten corner of the planet? Geological information or remnants of technology that had fallen from the sky? According to documents partially declassified after the war, certain circles within the NRB, the esoteric Nazi organization dedicated to archaeology, history, and the occult, were convinced that it was not a space rock that had fallen in Tunguska, but some kind of spacecraft or artifact of unknown origin. Along these lines, some argue that Hitler sent agents to Siberia in 1938 under the pretext of scientific expedition, but with the intention of recovering what they believed to be an extraterrestrial device or an advanced energy source. And if they succeeded? During the conflict, Germany made advances in the development of weapons and technologies that are still surprising today. From the B-2 rocket to flying saucer prototypes designed in secret laboratories. Could any of these advances have been inspired by materials or observations gathered in Tunguska? Even after the collapse of the Third Reich, the United States and the USSR seemed obsessed with that same territory. In the midst of the Cold War, both countries sent research missions to the crash site. The Soviets, in particular, established geological stations that, according to some defectors, were not studying the Earth, but something hidden beneath it. In 1965, an expedition led by Soviet scientist Alexei Saletov claimed to have detected disturbances in a magnetic field in the area, as well as anomalous behavior in electronic instruments. There were rumors that they were trying to excavate an object buried several meters deep. Nothing was officially confirmed, and the files remain sealed to this day. More recently, some independent researchers have linked Tunguska to tests of directed energy or even a prototype weapon by Nikola Tesla. An even bolder theory suggests that what happened in Siberia could have been a failed or successful experiment in remote energy manipulation, which, if true, would have attracted the attention of the military powers decades before World War II. And if Tunguska was not a natural accident, what if it was a deliberate or contained event? Whatever the case, the fact is that its story appears time and again in the margins of the great narratives of the 20th century, in files marked as classified, in accounts that were never published, in the silent obsessions of governments that, despite their differences, shared the same fear that something would fall from the sky and we would not know how to control it. Today, the taiga has regained its calm. But beneath that serenity lies a mystery that seems to defy time. What really happened in Tunguska? Was it the distant echo of a natural phenomenon or the first warning of something bigger? Perhaps the answer lies buried beneath the frozen crust of Siberia, waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps it has already been discovered, and we have simply been denied access to it.